The city of Boston, Massachusetts, in the early 1960s, was a portrait of quiet strength and tradition. Brick row houses lined narrow streets. Families gathered in modest apartments. Women walked home from work through the crisp New England evenings, trusting their neighborhoods the way people did back then. But by the summer of 1962, that sense of safety was about to shatter. Something dark began moving through the city. Something calculated, patient, and merciless. The press would soon give it a name that would haunt generations: the Boston Strangler. It started quietly. At first, the deaths seemed isolated, separate tragedies that no one could yet connect. In June 1962, a 55-year-old woman named Anna Sleezers was found dead in her apartment on Gainsborough Street. She had been strangled with the belt of her own bathrobe. Her body was discovered by her son, a man who would later describe the scene as something that didn't feel human. The apartment showed no sign of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. The killer had entered, murdered, and left as though he had vanished into thin air. Boston police had no reason, initially, to suspect that Anna's death was the beginning of a horrifying series of murders. They treated it as a tragic but singular crime, perhaps a burglary gone wrong. But then, just a few weeks later, another woman was found dead. This time it was 68-year-old Nina Nichols. She, too, had been strangled, and again, there were no signs of a break-in in her home. A nylon stocking was tied neatly around her neck in a bow. A chilling detail that would become the Strangler's twisted signature. Before the city could even process this second killing, a third occurred. 65-year-old Helen Blake was discovered dead in her Lynn, Massachusetts apartment, also strangled. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The victims were older women living alone, killed inside their homes by someone who showed no sign of forced entry. Each was left partially nude, with her own clothing used as a ligature. And most disturbingly, each crime scene displayed a peculiar symmetry: stockings, belts, or sashes tied into decorative knots. It was as if the murderer wanted his handiwork to be recognized. Panic began to ripple through Boston. For women living alone, fear became a daily companion. Hardware stores couldn't keep locks in stock. Newspapers printed warnings advising residents to check windows and doors twice before sleeping. Reporters began to connect the dots and gave birth to a name that would dominate headlines for the next several years: the Boston Strangler. As more bodies appeared, a city that once prided itself on its sense of community now lived under siege. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women, aged 19 to 80, 5, would be brutally murdered in their homes. The early victims were mostly older, but later attacks targeted younger women as well, challenging the theory that the killer preyed solely on the elderly. It became clear that no woman, regardless of age or neighborhood, was safe. The Boston Police Department, overwhelmed by public fear and political pressure, formed a special task force. Detectives worked endless shifts, interviewing neighbors, boyfriends, janitors, mail carriers, anyone who might have seen something, but every lead ended in a dead end. The killer seemed to leave no trace, no fingerprints, no witnesses. He operated with a confidence that mocked the city's police. Behind the scenes, investigators debated theories. Some believed the murderer gained entry by pretending to be a repairman, an apartment maintenance worker, or even a city official. Others suggested the victims might have known their killer, allowing him inside voluntarily. Yet as the bodies continued to appear, even seasoned detectives began to question everything they thought they knew about criminal behavior. How could a single man move so freely, strike so cleanly, and vanish without a sound in a city on high alert? As weeks turned into months, the fear deepened. Newspapers printed front-page stories about the Phantom Strangler. Television anchors used solemn tones as they listed the names of the dead. Boston's women, once independent and unafraid, now walked the streets in pairs, clutching their purses tightly. Landlords installed new locks. Husbands refused to let their wives stay home alone. For many, it wasn't just fear of death. It was the terror of not knowing who the killer might be. Was he a neighbor? A delivery man? Someone holding the door open at the laundromat? In neighborhoods like Back Bay, Dorchester, and Roxbury, whispers filled the night air. Everyone seemed to have a theory. Some claimed they had seen a suspicious man lurking in hallways. Others believed there were multiple killers, perhaps a copycat inspired by the headlines. Police, desperate for progress, questioned hundreds of suspects. They brought in psychics, hypnotists, and even criminologists from Harvard. Still, the case went nowhere. Amid this chaos, Boston's identity began to shift. The city, known for its intellect and order, now felt consumed by dread. It was as if evil itself had taken up residence in the brownstone apartments of ordinary citizens. The Boston Strangler was no longer just a killer. He had become a symbol of fear, of the limits of law enforcement, and of how fragile the illusion of safety could be. As 1962 drew to a close, 11 women had already been found dead. The killings had spread across different parts of Boston, defying geographical profiling. Investigators started to wonder, was it possible that more than one person was responsible? The crime scenes varied slightly, in method, in staging, in the killer's behavior. Some detectives argued these differences were simply the evolution of a single killer's technique. Others believed they were seeing the work of multiple murderers, hiding behind the same terrifying name. The confusion only deepened the public's paranoia. Boston became a city that trusted no one. Every knock on the door, every shadow in the hallway carried a new sense of danger. For the people living through those years, the name Boston Strangler was more than a headline. It was a haunting presence in their daily lives. And yet, despite the terror, despite the manhunt, despite the growing desperation of the police and the community, the killer, or killers, remained at large. The city waited for a break in the case, a face to match the nightmare, but none came. By the dawn of 1963, Boston had changed forever. The fear that once crept through the streets now lived inside its people. And somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the Boston Strangler was watching, waiting to strike again. Before the murders began, Boston in the early 1960s was a city in transition, a mixture of old traditions and new tensions. The city carried itself with a certain dignity, proud of its academic institutions, its rich colonial history, and its hard, working neighborhoods. But beneath the surface of this cultured facade, Boston was quietly struggling. Social change was coming fast. Racial divisions, economic inequality, and the early ripples of the women's liberation movement were reshaping the landscape. People were learning to live in a new kind of America, one that was modernizing but not yet ready for the changes ahead. At the start of the decade, Boston was a city of neighborhoods, each with its own accent, values, and sense of community. In Dorchester, working class families filled the triple-decker houses. In Back Bay, the brownstones stood as symbols of old wealth. Across the Charles River, Cambridge glimmered with the intellectual energy of Harvard and MIT. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where doors were often left unlocked, and where the idea of random violence seemed distant and unthinkable. Women, especially single women, lived modestly but independently. Many worked as secretaries, nurses, teachers, or clerks. Apartments were small but affordable. Boston, at least on the surface, was a safe city for women, a place where they could live alone, pursue careers, and walk home after dark without much fear. The idea that someone could break into an apartment and strangle a woman to death seemed like something out of a crime novel, not reality. Policing in Boston at that time was traditional, almost old-fashioned. Detectives relied heavily on instinct, confessions, and neighborhood gossip. Forensic science was still in its infancy. There were no DNA databases, no modern crime, scene management, and limited access to psychological profiling. The word forensics carried weight, but its tools were crude compared to what we know today. Most evidence was physical: fingerprints, shoe prints, or fibers, and often contaminated long before it could be analyzed. When a crime occurred, police would canvass the area, knock on doors, and hope someone had seen something. That method worked in communities where people talked to each other. But as Boston grew and urban anonymity spread, that approach began to fail. Many of the city's apartment buildings were large and impersonal, filled with tenants who barely knew one another. Neighbors might share walls, but not conversations. The Strangler took advantage of that. The loneliness of city life, the trust of strangers, and the quiet privacy of locked doors. At the same time, Boston's newspapers were powerful forces in shaping public opinion. The Boston Globe and Record American reached nearly every home. People trusted what they read. When the early stories about the silk stocking murders appeared, they ignited fascination and terror in equal measure. The media loved a mystery, and the idea of a killer targeting respectable women inside their homes became front-page gold. But that coverage also magnified the fear. Headlines screamed words like "Slayer stalks Boston" and "Woman strangled in their homes." Every new murder brought larger type, darker ink, and more speculation. This was an era before 24-hour news cycles. Yet the Strangler case managed to dominate every conversation. Housewives whispered about it over coffee. Taxi drivers discussed theories with passengers. Priests mentioned it in sermons, warning women to trust no stranger. Fear became part of the city's rhythm, and as more details leaked, the stockings tied in bows, the complete lack of forced entry, the image of the killer took on something almost mythic. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a phantom that could slip through walls. What made the situation worse was that Boston, at that moment in history, was already on edge. The civil rights movement was stirring racial tension across the country, and Boston was no exception. Economic disparities between neighborhoods were widening. Urban renewal projects displaced entire communities. The police force itself faced criticism for inefficiency and bias. Trust between citizens and law enforcement was fragile. When the murders began, many Bostonians doubted whether their police could actually protect them. For women, that fear was deeply personal. In a society that still expected women to be polite, accommodating, and trusting of authority, it was almost unimaginable that someone might use charm or deception to gain entry into their homes. The Strangler, as many investigators believed, exploited that very trust. Some reports suggested he posed as a repairman or maintenance worker, someone offering to fix a window, a faucet, or a light fixture. Others thought he might have claimed to be a delivery man or even a police officer. Whatever the disguise, it worked. The killer's victims often showed no signs of struggle, suggesting they had let him in willingly. In retrospect, Boston's vulnerability wasn't just physical. It was psychological. The city's social structure created the perfect storms, a culture of politeness, a lack of awareness about personal safety, and a police force unprepared for a predator who operated without a clear pattern. The women who became victims weren't careless. They were products of their time. A time when crime was still considered something that happened to other people. As fear took hold, daily life began to change. Women installed extra locks, kept lights burning through the night, and formed informal watch groups in apartment buildings. Men escorted wives and daughters to work. Landlords were flooded with requests for security improvements. But despite these precautions, the murders continued. The killer seemed to adapt faster than the city could react. Boston's identity as a city of intellect and order started to erode. People began to look at each other differently. A friendly stranger offering help suddenly seemed suspicious. The milkman, the plumber, the neighbor. Anyone could be the Strangler. This psychological paranoia spread faster than any police bulletin. In just a few months, the atmosphere in Boston had transformed from trust to terror. And while the city's leaders promised swift justice, the truth was far less reassuring. The police were lost in a maze of theories. Some officers clung to the idea of a single killer with a sexual compulsion. Others believed the pattern suggested multiple offenders, perhaps even unrelated copycats. But the pressure to deliver results was crushing. Every new murder was not just another tragedy. It was another headline that made the police look powerless. For ordinary citizens, that sense of helplessness became unbearable. the city that had given birth to the American Revolution, a place built on courage and reason, now seemed paralyzed by an invisible enemy. Fear moved through Boston's streets like a fog, silent and suffocating. By the end of 1962, the Boston Strangler was no longer just a local headline. He was a national phenomenon. Other cities watched nervously, wondering if similar killers might emerge in their streets. Federal agencies began to take notice, and within the Boston Police Department, a realization was dawning. This was not just another homicide investigation. It was a war against an enemy they didn't understand. A killer who seemed to be one step ahead at every turn. In that uneasy winter, as snow blanketed the city and women locked their doors, Boston waited for the next move. The killer had already changed everything. And he wasn't finished. Boston, 1962. The summer heat clung to the brick buildings like a heavy shadow, and in that shadow, something sinister began to stir. No one knew it yet, but the city was about to become the hunting ground of one of America's most chilling killers. The first murders of the Boston Strangler case would not only horrify the public, they would redefine how the nation understood fear, privacy, and trust. It began on June 14, 1962, with the death of Anna Sleezers, a 55-year-old Latvian immigrant who worked as a seamstress and lived alone in a small Boston apartment on Gainsborough Street. Anna was described by her neighbors as kind, devout, and quiet. The type of woman who minded her own business. That evening, her son, Juris, came by to check on her after she failed to answer the phone. When he opened the door, he stepped into a scene that would haunt him forever. His mother's lifeless body was found lying on the bathroom floor, nude, strangled with the belt from her own bathrobe. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing valuable had been taken. The apartment was neat, almost too neat, except for the horrifying sight of Anna's body. Police noted the strange detail that the bathrobe belt was tied into a large, decorative bow, as if the killer had taken his time, mocking the victim even in death. To the officers at the scene, it looked personal. They assumed it was a crime of passion, perhaps committed by someone she knew. But the truth was far darker. Just 2 weeks later, another woman was found dead. Nina Nichols, aged 68, lived alone in an upscale apartment on Commonwealth Avenue. She was a retired physiotherapist, active in her church and community. On June 30, 1962, her housekeeper discovered her body sprawled on the bedroom floor, strangled with 2 of her own nylon stockings. Like Anna Sleezers, Nina had been sexually assaulted, and her murderer had tied the stockings in an elaborate bow around her neck. Police were stunned by the similarities. Older woman, living alone, no forced entry, strangulation, and the eerie signature. The term pattern began to whisper through the precinct halls. Still, detectives hesitated to declare a serial killer. Boston had seen murders before, but never anything like this. 2 days later, their doubts would vanish. On July 2, 1962, Helen Blake, a 65-year-old woman, was found dead in her apartment in Lynn, just north of Boston. She, too, had been strangled, this time with her own nylon stockings. She was found nude, the knot around her neck tied neatly, almost artistically. The medical examiner reported evidence of sexual assault and noted that Helen's body had been carefully positioned, as though the killer wanted her to be seen in a certain way. The press caught wind of the connection between the three crimes and began publishing front-page stories about a silk-stocking murderer. Boston's fear turned to panic. Within weeks, women were buying deadbolts and chains by the thousands. Apartment landlords started screening maintenance workers. Neighbors began warning each other not to open the door for anyone, not even the police, unless identification was shown. The city's sense of safety was evaporating. As detectives pored over the evidence, they noticed something chilling. There was no sign of struggle in any of the cases. The killer wasn't breaking in. He was being let in. This suggested that he had some way of convincing women to trust him. Investigators theorized that he might be posing as a handyman, a deliveryman, or even a building inspector. The possibility that the murderer could appear friendly, polite, even helpful made the crimes all the more terrifying. Then came the murder of Margaret Davis, age 60, found strangled in her Roxbury apartment on August 19, 1962. Once again, the killer used the victim's own clothing to end her life. Police records described the scene as organized, deliberate, and disturbingly calm. The killer seemed to know exactly what he was doing, how to enter quietly, control his victim, and leave no trace. By now, the Boston Police Department had accepted the grim reality. A serial killer was on the loose. The city had never dealt with a case like this before. Detectives formed special task forces, calling in experts from across Massachusetts. The FBI began quietly offering assistance, though profiling as a formal science didn't yet exist. The term serial killer itself was not widely used. At the time, investigators referred to such criminals as sequence murderers or pattern killers. But whatever the label, one truth was clear. Boston was dealing with a predator who hunted by design. As the summer turned into fall, the killer's behavior began to evolve. On September 8, 1962, Jane Sullivan, a 67-year-old nurse, was found strangled in her Dorchester apartment. Unlike previous victims, Jane's body had been dead for several days before discovery. The heat had made the scene unbearable for investigators. Once again, the same pattern: strangulation, no forced entry, personal items used as murder weapons, and a bow. The killer seemed to vanish after that for several months, and for a while, the city dared to hope that it was over, but the calm didn't last. The next murder would break the pattern and expand the terror. On December 5, 1962, Sophie Clark, a 20-year-old student, was found strangled in her Huntington Avenue apartment. Sophie was young, educated, and black, nothing like the previous victims. Her inclusion shattered the theory that the strangler only targeted older white women. It was the moment the city realized this killer had no boundaries. The change in victim profile suggested a disturbing truth. The murderer was not driven by rage against a specific type of person, but by opportunity and compulsion. The fact that Sophie had been careful about safety, That she lived in a busy building surrounded by students made her murder even more chilling. Whoever the killer was, he could adapt, evolve, and blend in wherever he went. By early 1963, 7 women had been killed in almost identical ways. Newspapers published maps showing the locations of the murders, connecting dots across the Boston area like a spider's web. Television anchors used words like terror, stalking, and evil. The phrase Boston Strangler became an everyday term, whispered in grocery lines and shouted from headlines. Detectives, desperate for a lead, re-interviewed suspects, tracked known sex offenders, and even considered the possibility that the killer was someone within the police or maintenance services. But nothing fit. The killer left no fingerprints, no fibers that could be traced, no witnesses who had seen him enter or leave. It was as if he was invisible, a ghost moving from apartment to apartment, killing with precision, and disappearing without a sound. The early murders of the Boston Strangler established a horrifying pattern. The victims were women living alone. The killer gained entry without force. He strangled them with their own belongings. The bodies were sexually assaulted and staged, and always, there was the bow. Those early months in Boston marked the beginning of one of the most infamous manhunts in American history. The city, once proud of its intellect and civility, had become the center of a mystery that defied logic and science, and the Strangler, whoever he was, had only just begun. By the beginning of 1963, the city of Boston was caught in a psychological vice. The murders that had begun quietly in the summer of 1962 were now the only story anyone could talk about. In kitchens, offices, and bars, the conversation always came back to the same question: who is the Boston Strangler? The newspapers had given him the name after noticing one peculiar and haunting detail that connected the victims: stockings, belts or sashes tied into neat, deliberate bows around their necks. The silk stocking murders, as the press called them, painted a picture of a killer both brutal and meticulous. Each scene was violent, yet disturbingly ordered, as if the murderer took pride in his work. The city's fear had now reached a fever pitch. Boston was no longer just a place of learning and tradition. It was a city under siege. Women who once walked freely now moved in pairs, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Apartment doors that once stood open for neighbors were now bolted shut. Hardware stores across the city couldn't keep locks, latches, and chains on the shelves. Fear had become a commodity. The Boston Police Department found itself drowning in leads. The special task force assigned to the case grew to over 100 officers, detectives, and forensic experts. But the truth was brutal. They were chasing shadows. There was no pattern of forced entry, no fingerprints, no clear witness statements. The killer struck randomly and left no trace. In those early months, the press became both an ally and an enemy. Newspapers were desperate for headlines. Every new detail, no matter how speculative, made the front page. The Boston Globe, the Herald, and the Record American competed daily to break new developments. They printed crime scene photos, published interviews with frightened residents and ran editorials condemning the police for their lack of progress. The media's relentless coverage shaped how people understood the case. The Boston Strangler became more than a man. He became a myth, an invisible force capable of entering any home, killing any woman, and vanishing into the night. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a presence that haunted the entire city. Television added another layer to the hysteria. Local broadcasts aired updates almost nightly. Reporters stood outside apartment buildings where murders had occurred, their voices trembling as they described the scenes. The killer could be anyone, one anchor warned during a 1963 broadcast. He might live in your neighborhood. He might walk your streets. Those words lingered in living rooms across Massachusetts, replaying in the minds of families as they locked their doors that night. The pattern of the murders continued, and with each killing, the Strangler seemed to grow bolder. In December 1962, the murder of Sophie Clark, young, educated, and black, shattered the city's assumptions. The victims were no longer just elderly women. Fear now crossed racial and class boundaries. No one felt safe. Then, in March 1963, Patricia Bissett, a 23-year-old receptionist, was found strangled in her Beacon Street apartment. She was engaged to be married, known for her bright smile and kindness. Her murder marked another turning point. Patricia was the first pregnant victim, and her death provoked outrage across Boston. The newspapers described her as an innocent symbol of the city's lost peace. Investigators were desperate for a breakthrough. Detectives began to notice subtle differences between crime scenes. Some showed signs of struggle, others didn't. Some victims were sexually assaulted, others weren't. The knots were similar, but not identical. The killer's method seemed to shift slightly from murder to murder. This inconsistency raised a troubling question. Was there really just one Boston Strangler? Or more than one? At first, police dismissed the idea of multiple killers. The similarities between cases were too strong to ignore, but behind closed doors, some detectives began to whisper that maybe the media had created the idea of a single strangler, when in reality, Boston might be facing several predators taking advantage of the chaos. The city's panic had become so widespread that it provided cover for copycats. Still, the pattern continued. On May 6, 1963, Beverly Simmons, a 23-year-old graduate student studying opera at the Boston Conservatory, was found strangled and stabbed in her apartment. The violence in her murder was excessive. Multiple stab wounds to the chest and neck, yet the ligature still tied in a bow. The stabbing seemed out of character compared to the earlier killings, suggesting an emotional outburst. Investigators debated whether the Strangler had lost control or if this was the work of someone else entirely. Boston was suffocating under its own fear. Women started forming self-defense groups, churches held prayer vigils, and neighborhood watches sprang up across the city. Police stations were flooded with calls reporting suspicious men, repairmen, delivery drivers, door-to-door salesmen. Most turned out to be innocent, but the paranoia was spreading faster than the investigation could contain it. By the summer of 1963, the case had drawn national attention. The FBI and state police were now actively involved. Criminologists began to profile the killer, even though the term profile wasn't yet standard practice. They described him as intelligent, articulate, and possibly employed in a job that gave him access to women's homes. Perhaps a handyman, delivery worker, or serviceman. They suggested he might have deep, seated resentment toward women and could appear polite and trustworthy. It was a chilling portrait because it fit thousands of men in Boston. As newspapers ran daily updates, the media frenzy reached its breaking point. Some editors began to wonder whether the intense coverage was doing more harm than good. There was a growing fear that the publicity might be feeding the killer's ego, that he was watching the news, reading the headlines, and relishing the fear he caused. In September 1963, the murders seemed to stop. For months, there were no new victims. Boston exhaled cautiously, believing the nightmare might finally be over. But detectives weren't convinced. They had seen too much, and they knew killers like this rarely just stop. Their instincts were right. In January 1964, the Strangler returned. Mary Sullivan, 19 years old, was found dead in her Charles Street apartment, strangled with a silk scarf. A greeting card that read, "Happy New Year," was left beside her body, a cruel, mocking signature. The city was horrified. The youngest and final known victim of the Boston Strangler. Mary's death reignited the fear that had begun to fade. The silk stocking murders were now part of Boston's identity. 13 women had been killed over 2 years. The killer, or killers, had eluded every trap, outsmarted every investigator, and left a scar that would never heal. By early 1964, the phrase Boston Strangler had entered American folklore. The case wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about society's vulnerability, the illusion of safety, and the terrifying possibility that evil could hide behind the most ordinary smile. The police were out of leads. The city was running out of hope. And the killer, whoever he was, had vanished into the very streets he once haunted. But the story was far from over. The investigation was about to take a shocking new turn, one that would blur the line between truth and deception and raise questions that still haunt criminologists to this day. The city of Boston, once vibrant and proud, had turned into a place of constant tension. It was now 1964, more than 2 years since the first strangling, and the fear that once swept the city had hardened into frustration. Every woman who walked home at night felt the weight of invisible eyes upon her. Every husband, brother, and son feared that someone close to them could be next. For the Boston Police Department, the investigation into the so-called silk stocking murders had become a labyrinth of dead ends. Detectives were working endless shifts, their desks buried under stacks of crime reports, photos, and witness statements. The walls of the homicide unit were covered with maps dotted with red pins, each marking the home of a victim. From an aerial view, the pattern looked random, scattered across neighborhoods with no obvious link. But to the detectives staring at it day after day, It felt like a code they just couldn't crack. Each murder had been brutal, intimate, and precise. The killer seemed to know exactly what he was doing. He left no fingerprints, no blood trails, and no signs of forced entry. It was as if he could walk through locked doors, strike without sound, and disappear into thin air. Investigators began to wonder, was he someone the victims trusted? A familiar face? Or perhaps a man who could blend in so easily that he was invisible even when standing right in front of them? Captain John Stewart, head of the Special Task Force, sat in his office most nights staring at the case board. He'd been a cop for 20 years, and nothing had ever haunted him like this. Each photo of a victim, their faces once full of life, now stared back at him as if demanding justice. He often muttered to himself, "He's smart, too smart." The FBI had joined the case by mid-1964. They're criminal psychologists. Though still in the early days of behavioral profiling, described the Strangler as methodical, intelligent, and likely organized. He probably had a routine, a job that gave him mobility and access to people's homes. He might even have a family, someone who lives among us, one profiler noted grimly. Someone who appears normal. Meanwhile, the press continued to shape public perception of the case. Reporters printed sketches of possible suspects, while radio hosts speculated about every new lead. Each rumor seemed to twist the truth further. Some believed the killer was a deranged doctor. Others thought he was a war veteran suffering from trauma. There were even whispers that it might be a priest or a policeman. The line between reality and hysteria blurred. The police received thousands of tips, most of them useless. Every man who fit the vague description became a suspect. Detectives interrogated deliverymen, repair workers, janitors, and doormen. But for every name they crossed off the list, 2 more appeared. What made things worse was that the killings didn't follow a consistent timeline. Weeks, sometimes months, passed between murders. Then, without warning, another body would be found. The killer's ability to vanish, to stay dormant and then strike again, was deeply unsettling. It made the detectives question whether they were even dealing with the same man. Behind the scenes, tensions grew between the Boston police and the Attorney General's office. The investigation had become politically charged. No one wanted to be blamed for failing to stop the city's most infamous killer. Meetings turned into shouting matches, and valuable time was lost in bureaucratic chaos. Still, investigators pressed on, determined to find any common thread. Forensic science in the 1960s was limited. There was no DNA testing, no computerized databases. Every clue had to be analyzed by hand. Detectives compared handwriting from phone books and letters, examined footprints, and analyzed fibers from the victim's clothing. But the killer always seemed to be one step ahead. By the summer of 1964, the case seemed frozen. The murders had stopped again. Some detectives began to believe the Strangler might have died, been imprisoned for another crime, or moved to another city. Others, like Captain Stewart, refused to accept that. "He's out there," he said one night to his team. "He's watching us. He's waiting for us to let our guard down. Then came a small breakthrough, not from the police, but from a psychologist named Dr. Ames Robbie, who had been following the case closely. He believed the killer might be a man who struggled with sexual identity and deep psychological trauma. He suggested that the murders could be acts of control, ways for the killer to feel powerful in a life where he otherwise felt helpless. Robbie's theory was controversial, but it gave investigators something new to consider: the psychology of the Strangler. That fall, police began conducting quiet interviews with known sex offenders and burglars who had operated in the same neighborhoods as the victims. One name appeared more than once: Albert DeSalvo, a repairman known for breaking into women's apartments under the guise of doing maintenance work. But at that time, he was just another name in a long list of potential suspects. There was no evidence linking him to the murders. He was at most a petty criminal. Still, some officers made note of him. DeSalvo had a strange reputation: polite, well-spoken, but unnervingly persuasive. Several women had reported encounters with him, describing how he'd shown up at their doors, claiming to be from a modeling agency or a building inspector, trying to talk his way inside. He was charming, confident, and strangely disarming. To most investigators, he didn't seem dangerous, at least not yet. As the investigation dragged on, the weight of failure hung heavy over the city's law enforcement. Reporters mocked the police for their lack of progress. One headline read, "Boston Strangler vanishes. Police still searching for a ghost." The pressure was unbearable. Every unsolved murder, every unanswered question felt like another stain on the city's conscience. Then, in early 1965, something unexpected happened. A series of unrelated sexual assault cases began surfacing. Women described being attacked in their apartments by a man who claimed to be a measuring man, sent to take their body measurements for a modeling company. The attacker was polite at first, but once inside, he bound them and assaulted them. He never killed them. But his methodical nature and calm demeanor caught investigators' attention. When the police finally arrested the man responsible for those assaults, his name shocked them: Albert DeSalvo. At first, it seemed like just another case of sexual violence. But as detectives began to question him, pieces of a much darker puzzle started to align. His background, his access to women's apartments, his charm, and his control over victims all eerily resembled the Boston Strangler's methods. The investigation had finally found a suspect who fit the profile. But as they would soon discover, DeSalvo's story was far from simple. His confessions would ignite controversy, divide experts, and leave behind one of the most debated mysteries in American criminal history. For the police, it felt like they were finally pulling back the curtain on a nightmare. For Boston, it was the beginning of another, one filled with doubt, deception, and unanswered questions. By the time Albert DeSalvo's name began echoing through the halls of Boston police headquarters, the city had been living under the shadow of the Strangler for nearly 3 years. For detectives exhausted by dead ends and public outrage, DeSalvo appeared like a ghost stepping out of the fog, a suspect who seemed too ordinary, too polite, and yet too perfect to ignore. Born in Chelsea, Massachusetts in 1931, Albert Henry DeSalvo was the son of a violent alcoholic father and a mother who endured years of abuse. From a young age, Albert learned that fear and control were tools, instruments to get what one wanted. His childhood was marred by poverty, beatings, and the constant sound of his parents' fights. By his teenage years, he was already in trouble with the law, caught for petty theft and burglary. Despite his criminal background, there was something disarmingly normal about him. He was clean, cut, charming, even handsome in a working-class way. He married a woman named Irmgard Beck and had children. To his neighbors, he seemed like a decent family man. A little odd, perhaps, but nothing like the monster the newspapers described. But behind that calm exterior lay a fractured psyche. DeSalvo had an obsession with women, control, and attention. He longed to be seen, to be recognized, to be important. That hunger for recognition would soon lead him into the center of one of the most controversial criminal confessions in American history. It all began in late 1964, when DeSalvo was arrested for a series of bizarre sexual assaults. His victims referred to him as the measuring man. He would pose as a talent scout, claiming he was collecting measurements for modeling opportunities. Once inside their apartments, he would pull out a tape measure, ask the women to pose, and then suddenly attack, tying them up and sexually assaulting them. His crimes were brutal but non-lethal, a sharp contrast to the Boston Stranglers' murders. When police caught DeSalvo in 1964, they had no reason to connect him to the killings. He wasn't violent in the same way, but after he was sent to Bridgewater State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation, he crossed paths with another inmate, George Nassar, a convicted murderer known for his intelligence and manipulative charm. It was Nassar who first brought DeSalvo's confession to the attention of the authorities. According to Nassar, DeSalvo had begun talking about the Boston Strangler murders in vivid, horrifying detail, describing the victims, their homes, and even the way he tied the knots around their necks. He told me he was the Strangler, Nassar later claimed. He said he wanted to tell the truth, but only if he could get help for his family. When investigators interviewed DeSalvo, they were stunned by what he knew. He described the victims, their apartments, and specific items found at crime scenes, details that had never been released to the public. He spoke calmly, methodically, even proudly, as if recounting someone else's story. To many, it sounded like the confession of a man unburdening his sins. But there were problems, big ones. DeSalvo never provided physical evidence linking him to the murders. No fingerprints, no stolen items, no eyewitnesses. He couldn't remember exact dates or sequences of events. In some cases, his descriptions didn't perfectly match the crime scenes. And though he confessed to all 13 murders attributed to the Boston Strangler, investigators noticed inconsistencies that suggested multiple killers could have been at work. Still, the police were desperate for closure. The public wanted an end to the fear. And so, in 1965, they announced that Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. The reaction was explosive. Newspapers called him the monster next door. The public was both relieved and disturbed. Relieved that the killings had stopped, but disturbed by the ordinariness of the man responsible. How could someone so average, so unassuming, have committed such unimaginable crimes? Yet even as DeSalvo's name became infamous, not everyone was convinced. Several detectives, including some who had worked the original murder scenes, expressed doubts. They believed DeSalvo was a compulsive confessor, a man desperate for attention and recognition. Others pointed to his friendship with George Nassar, suggesting that Nassar, far more intelligent and cunning, might have fed DeSalvo the details in exchange for a potential reward. There was also legal problems. DeSalvo was never actually tried for the Boston Strangler murders. He was convicted only for the Green Man assaults, the non-fatal attacks that had led to his arrest in the first place. Despite his confession, prosecutors had no physical evidence to link him directly to the stranglings. Inside Bridgewater State Hospital, DeSalvo's behavior grew erratic. He would tell psychiatrists about the killings one day, then deny them the next. He claimed he had a split personality, that when he became the Strangler, he lost control of himself. Some doctors believed him. Others thought he was fabricating the story to gain notoriety or protect someone else. When reporters interviewed him, DeSalvo seemed eager to talk about the crimes. "I'm not proud of it," he said in one chilling interview. "But I wanted people to know who I am. I wanted to be remembered." Those words, more than anything, revealed his deepest motive, a hunger not just for control, but for immortality through infamy. As the years passed, the controversy only deepened. Investigators revisited the evidence, trying to match DeSalvo's statements to the physical facts. Some murders aligned perfectly with his descriptions, others did not. Certain forensic experts concluded that multiple killers were likely involved, imitating one another amid the media frenzy. The city of Boston, desperate to move on, largely accepted DeSalvo's confession as truth. But among law enforcement and the victims' families, doubts persisted. Had the real Boston Strangler been caught, or had a deeply disturbed man simply taken credit for crimes he didn't commit? In 1967, DeSalvo was sentenced to life in prison. Even behind bars, he continued to toy with the truth, sometimes boasting, sometimes retracting. He became a kind of mythic figure, part killer, part liar, part tragic product of a broken childhood and a city's fear. Then, in 1973, the story took one final, shocking turn. Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole State Prison. The murder was never officially solved. Some believed it was revenge from another inmate. Others whispered that DeSalvo had been silenced, perhaps because he knew something that could append the accepted story. In death, as in life, Albert DeSalvo remained a riddle. Was he the Boston Strangler, the phantom who terrorized Boston's women? Or was he merely a man lost in his own lies, a confused criminal who wanted to be someone greater, even if that meant becoming a monster? The truth, as Boston would learn in the years to come, might lie somewhere between confession and conspiracy. To truly understand the terror that gripped Boston in the early 1960s, one must peer beyond the headlines, beyond the police reports, into the twisted psychology that might drive a man to commit such unspeakable acts. Whether Albert DeSalvo was truly the Boston Strangler, or simply a man who claimed the role for attention, his confessions opened a chilling window into the mind of someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. Psychiatrists, criminologists, and psychologists of the era were captivated by the case. Serial murder, as a recognized psychological pattern, was still a new concept. The FBI's behavioral science unit had only just begun to study criminal profiling, but the Boston Strangler case was already teaching investigators and scientists something terrifying. That evil could hide beneath the most ordinary human face. Dr. Ames Rabe, one of the first psychiatrists to evaluate DeSalvo, described him as a man divided within himself. On the surface, DeSalvo appeared articulate and intelligent, even remorseful. But underneath there was chaos, a deep, festering rage and a craving for dominance. Rabe wrote that DeSalvo had a powerful compulsion to possess women, not sexually alone, but completely. Body, mind, and soul. This need for control was at the heart of his crimes. Strangulation, after all, is one of the most intimate forms of murder. It requires proximity, physical contact, and a deliberate choice to watch life fade from another person's eyes. For psychologists, this method revealed more than brutality. It revealed obsession. The Strangler didn't simply want to kill. He wanted to control the moment of death itself. But where did that compulsion come from? DeSalvo's childhood held many of the ingredients that modern psychologists associate with violent offenders. Abuse, humiliation, and powerlessness. His father, Frank DeSalvo, was notoriously cruel. He beat Albert's mother in front of the children, sometimes forcing them to watch as he held a knife to her throat. He also sold his young daughters for sexual favors to other men, leaving lasting trauma throughout the family. For young Albert, violence became normal, a language spoken in pain and fear. To survive, he learned to detach, to compartmentalize. That early emotional fracture may have created the psychological foundation for his later actions. When he attacked women, some experts argued he was reenacting the dominance he had seen in his father, reversing the helplessness of his childhood by assuming the role of the aggressor. Dr. Rabe and others noted another strange element: DeSalvo's craving for recognition. He wanted to be known, remembered, even admired. He often boasted about his intelligence, his memory, his special skills. Some psychiatrists believed this narcissistic streak was what drove him to confess. Even if he hadn't committed all the murders, he wanted to be the man who terrified Boston. Fame, even as a monster, was better than obscurity. But there were still inconsistencies. When psychologists interviewed DeSalvo about the specific murders, his emotional tone rarely matched his words. He described the killings with a strange calmness, even detachment, as if narrating a movie he had watched rather than something he had done. He never expressed real remorse or excitement, only curiosity, as though he was trying to understand himself as much as the doctors were trying to understand him. To Dr. Harry Kozol, a renowned forensic psychiatrist who also evaluated DeSalvo, this detachment was key. Kozol believed DeSalvo was not insane, but deeply narcissistic and possibly sociopathic, capable of mimicking emotion without feeling it. He was not possessed by madness, Kozol later said, but by an emptiness so profound that he tried to fill it with power over others. This theory aligned with emerging studies of the time. The Boston Strangler case, alongside others from the 1950s and 60s, helped shape early ideas about psychopathy. The condition marked by superficial charm, lack of empathy, and manipulative behavior. DeSalvo, they argued, fit this mold perfectly. He was a man who could smile as he lied, comfort as he killed, and charm as he confessed. Yet there was another possibility: dissociation. Some experts proposed that DeSalvo may have experienced dissociative identity disorder, what was then called split personality. According to this theory, his violent alter ego, the Strangler, emerged during episodes of psychological dissociation triggered by stress or sexual frustration. In these moments, DeSalvo might have lost conscious control, entering a trance-like state where his repressed rage exploded into violence. However, skeptics rejected this explanation. They noted that DeSalvo's actions showed too much planning, too much control. He selected his victims carefully, left little evidence, and even tied decorative bows at his crime scenes. This was not the work of a man lost in delusion. It was the work of someone who enjoyed mastery, precision, and ritual. Still, not all of the murders matched this pattern, which continued to fuel the debate about whether DeSalvo acted alone. Some victims were younger, others older. Some were sexually assaulted, others were not. The differences in methods, from the type of ligature used to the degree of staging, suggested that multiple killers might have been at work, each feeding off the hysteria surrounding the Boston Strangler name. To many psychologists, this idea was both terrifying and plausible. The fear generated by the murders had become so widespread, so mythic, that it could inspire imitation. A single killer might have started the nightmare, but hysteria could have birthed others. It was a city under psychological siege, a living experiment in how fear spreads, distorts, and multiplies. By the late 1960s, the Strangler case had become a staple of academic study. It wasn't just about murder. It was about identity, control, and society's fragile grasp on sanity. In classrooms and police seminars, experts dissected the case to understand how a seemingly ordinary man could become a symbol of terror. Some saw in DeSalvo the reflection of modern alienation, a man detached from morality, seeking meaning through violence. Others saw him as a product of abuse and neglect, shaped by trauma and desperation. But all agreed on one thing: the Boston Strangler was more than a killer. He was a mirror held up to the darker side of human nature, the capacity for cruelty that hides behind the mask of normalcy. Even decades later, forensic psychologists revisiting the case continued to debate what truly drove him. Was it sexual compulsion, a need for dominance, or simply the void of a man who felt invisible until the world finally saw him? Even if it was as a monster, the answers, like the man himself, remained fragmented. The Boston Strangler was not just a person, but a phenomenon, born of fear, fed by media, and immortalized by uncertainty. And as experts continued to analyze his mind, Boston remained haunted by a chilling truth that understanding evil does not make it any less real. In the dimly lit interrogation room at Bridgewater State Hospital, the reel-to-reel recorder clicked on. The sound of the spinning tape filled the silence, marking the beginning of one of the most controversial confession sessions in American criminal history. Sitting across from investigators was a calm, clean, shaven man in his mid-30s, Albert DeSalvo. He wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't shouting or sweating. He spoke softly, almost conversationally, as if recounting someone else's memories. These recordings, known today as the confession tapes, would shape the narrative of the Boston Strangler case for decades. To the public, they were the voice of a killer revealing his darkest secrets. But to many experts, they were something else. A performance, perhaps, or the creation of a man who wanted to be remembered for something, even something monstrous. The first session began with detectives asking DeSalvo to recount how it all started. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and said in an eerily steady tone, "It wasn't about hate. It was about control. I didn't want to hurt them. I wanted them to know I could." The detectives exchanged nervous glances. It wasn't what they expected to hear from a man accused of 13 brutal murders. For hours, DeSalvo spoke with unsettling clarity. He described the victims' apartments, their clothes, even the layout of the rooms. He explained how he gained entry, posing as a maintenance worker, a delivery man, sometimes simply asking to use the phone. Once inside, he would disarm his victims with kindness, then turn on them in an instant. He told the story of Anna Sleezers, the first known victim. "She let me in," he said. "She didn't think twice. She turned her back for a moment, and that's when I knew." His voice didn't tremble. He didn't flinch when describing the act of strangulation. Instead, he seemed analytical, detached, as though narrating a process rather than a killing. At one point, a detective asked, "Why did you tie the knots that way? The bows, the loops?" DeSalvo smiled faintly. "Because I wanted people to know it was me," he replied. "You leave a mark, something they'll recognize next time." That comment sent chills through the room. It was both boastful and revealing. To the investigators, it sounded like the voice of a true killer, someone who wanted ownership of his crimes. But to psychologists, it sounded rehearsed, almost scripted, as if DeSalvo knew what they wanted to hear. As the tapes rolled, contradictions began to appear. DeSalvo would mix up dates, locations, even the order of the murders. Sometimes, he described details that were wrong: a curtain color, an item of clothing, or a room layout that didn't match the actual crime scene. When detectives corrected him, he adjusted his story smoothly, without hesitation. That adaptability was both suspicious and unnerving. It suggested that he might be building the story from information fed to him through media reports, police leaks, or even from his cellmate, George Nassar, who was known to have a near photographic memory and had access to newspapers. To many inside the department, the confession was both a blessing and a burden. They finally had a man willing to take responsibility for the killings, which could bring closure to a city scarred by fear. Yet, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. The case needed evidence, something physical to confirm the words on those tapes. But there was none. Still, the recordings continued for weeks. DeSalvo's tone shifted depending on his mood. Sometimes, he sounded proud, even theatrical. Other times, he spoke like a man confused by his own actions, describing his crimes as if watching them from outside his body. It was like someone else was there, he said once. Like I was just watching myself. Psychiatrists listening to the tapes later described this as dissociative language, the speech of someone detached from their deeds. But skeptics called it manipulation, a way for DeSalvo to appear mentally unstable and avoid a harsh sentence. Meanwhile, the press caught wind of the confession. Headlines exploded across Boston. Ostester stier angel ear for UND, mena DMBS TO 13 manier DRs. For the terrified city, it felt like closure at last. But for investigators behind the scenes, it wasn't so simple. Without physical evidence, they couldn't charge DeSalvo with the murders. He was prosecuted instead for the Green Man assaults, the sexual attacks that led to his arrest in the first place. The confession tapes were never used in court. Yet, those recordings became a symbol of the case. They were played to experts, journalists, and criminologists. Everyone had a different interpretation. Some heard the voice of a killer cleansing his conscience. Others heard an intelligent manipulator seeking attention, piecing together public information into a believable narrative. Dr. Harry Kozol, who had spent hours interviewing DeSalvo, believed the tapes revealed more about the man's psyche than his guilt. He was a man desperate to matter, Kozol said. He found meaning in infamy. If he couldn't be loved, he would be feared. There was also the question of motive, not just for the murders, but for the confession itself. Some speculated that DeSalvo confessed in hopes of selling his story, securing money for his wife and children. Others thought George Nassar had coached him, offering to help in exchange for a share of the reward or leniency in his own case. As the tapes continued, it became clear that DeSalvo enjoyed the attention. He spoke like an actor reliving scenes from a script, pausing for effect, watching the detectives' reactions. At times, he corrected them, as if asserting dominance even in the interview room. "You've got that part wrong," he'd say. "I didn't tie it that way. Let me tell you how it really was." For the detectives who had spent years chasing shadows, the experience was disorienting. Was this the real Strangler finally speaking, or a man playing the role too convincingly? The recordings ended in 1965, leaving behind hours of conflicting statements, fragments of truth woven with invention. To this day, experts studying those tapes can't agree on their authenticity. What they reveal with certainty is not guilt or innocence, but psychological need, a desperate hunger for validation, attention, and identity. And that, perhaps, is what made the Boston Strangler case so haunting. Whether DeSalvo was the killer or merely the man who claimed to be, the confessions captured something far deeper than crime. They exposed the fragility of truth, how easily it can be shaped by fear, by ego, and by the human desire to be seen. As the reel stopped spinning and the final click echoed in the empty room, the investigators turned off the machine. Outside, the world believed the case was closed, but for those who had heard the voice on the tapes, calm, cold, and unshaken, the questions were just beginning. Was this truly the Boston Strangler, or had the real killer's voice never been heard at all? The year was 1967, and Boston was still struggling to recover from the terror that had gripped it for years. The headlines had declared the case solved. The police had their man, Albert DeSalvo, the self-proclaimed Boston Strangler. Yet, when the trial began, something strange became immediately clear. DeSalvo wasn't on trial for murder. Instead, he was facing charges for a series of sexual assaults. The Green Man attacks, crimes that, though horrific, were not the same as the string of murders that had made the city infamous. To the public, this seemed confusing, even contradictory. How could the man who confessed to killing 13 women not be facing trial for it? But the prosecution had no physical evidence tying him to the stranglings. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no DNA testing technology existed yet to prove the connection. As the trial began in the Cambridge Superior Court, journalists filled every seat, cameras flashed, and whispers spread through the corridors like wildfire. DeSalvo entered wearing a plain suit, calm and expressionless. To many watching him, he didn't look like a monster. He looked ordinary, like the man next door. That unsettling normalcy made the story even more chilling. His attorney, F. Lee Bailey, was already a rising star in the legal world. He had previously represented Dr. Sam Shepard, whose case later inspired The Fugitive. Bailey saw DeSalvo's case as both a challenge and an opportunity, a chance to test the limits of confession, psychology, and justice. From the start, Bailey took an unconventional approach. He didn't try to prove DeSalvo's innocence. Instead, he argued that his client was mentally unfit to stand trial. A man driven by uncontrollable impulses, deserving psychiatric treatment rather than imprisonment. Albert is sick, Bailey told the court. He needs help, not punishment. To demonstrate this, Bailey presented portions of DeSalvo's confession tapes, allowing the jury to hear his calm, clinical descriptions of the murders. The courtroom grew tense as DeSalvo's voice filled the air. She didn't scream. She just looked at me. I tied the cord around her neck and watched the light go out. The jurors listened, some turning pale. There was no emotion in the voice, no remorse, no hesitation. It was chillingly detached. Yet, for all the horror it conveyed, the prosecution reminded the court that there was no hard evidence linking those words to the real crimes. He says he's the strangler. One prosecutor told the jury, but saying it doesn't make it so. As the trial went on, the public became divided. Newspapers printed every detail, from DeSalvo's childhood to his alleged motives. Radio talk shows debated whether he was a monster or a mentally ill man caught in the system. Housewives discussed the case in grocery lines. Students debated it in classrooms, and men in bars speculated about whether justice would ever truly be served. To the media, DeSalvo was now the face of evil, the embodiment of the Boston Strangler myth. The real complexity of the case, the doubts about his guilt, and the holes in the evidence all got buried under sensational headlines. The city, exhausted by years of fear, wanted closure more than truth. During cross-examination, prosecutors pressed DeSalvo's mental state. A psychiatrist testified that he showed signs of multiple personality disorder, while another expert argued that he was completely aware of his actions and seeking fame. DeSalvo himself sat quietly, sometimes smiling faintly, as though detached from the entire performance. When he finally took the stand, he spoke softly. "I just want to know why," he said. "Why I did those things. Why I couldn't stop." His tone was reflective, even sorrowful. But whether it was genuine remorse or rehearsed performance remained unclear. Bailey's closing argument was powerful, even poetic. He told the jury that society had failed DeSalvo long before he failed his victims. "This is not a case of evil," he said. "It's a case of sickness. Albert DeSalvo is not a beast. He's a broken man." But when the verdict came, the jury saw things differently. Guilty on all counts. DeSalvo was sentenced to life in prison for the Green Man assaults. Though he was never tried for the Boston Strangler murders, the public accepted the outcome as the closest thing to justice they would ever get. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered. Some cheered, others wept. Reporters shouted questions. "Do you believe you're the Strangler, Albert?" one called out. DeSalvo looked up, smiled slightly, and said, "I know what I am." Then he was led away, but behind closed doors, not everyone was convinced. Several detectives who had worked the Strangler cases still doubted his guilt. Some believed the murders had been committed by multiple offenders, possibly copycats inspired by the initial killings. The differences in the victims' ages, methods, and circumstances didn't fit one consistent pattern. Even F. Lee Bailey, who had become famous through the case, admitted privately that he wasn't entirely sure. "If Albert wasn't the Strangler," he once said, "then the real one got away with murder." As DeSalvo began serving his sentence at Walpole State Prison, the Boston Strangler case slowly faded from the headlines. The city tried to move on, though the fear had left scars that would take years to heal. Yet, in the shadows of that so-called justice, the legend of the Boston Strangler grew. He became a cultural figure, a subject of books, movies, and endless speculation. The 1968 film The Boston Strangler, starring Tony Curtis, cemented the image of DeSalvo as the definitive killer in the public mind. The film portrayed him as a man torn between guilt and madness, further blurring the line between fact and fiction. But for those who had seen the case up close, It was never that simple. Detectives knew the inconsistencies, psychiatrists saw the manipulation, and journalists uncovered holes that refused to close. The trial, for all its drama, had created a monster, not necessarily in DeSalvo, but in the story itself. By the end of the 1960s, the Boston Strangler was no longer just a name. He was a symbol of fear, of failure, and of the fragile line between truth and narrative. The city had found its villain, and the world had its legend. But deep down, the question that haunted everyone remained the same. Had justice really been served? Or had Boston merely convicted its own peace of mind? The steel door clanged shut behind him, echoing down the cold concrete corridor of Walpole State Prison. For the first time, Albert DeSalvo, the man the world called the Boston Strangler, was caged not by speculation or accusation, but by unbreakable walls. His trial was over. His name was infamous. Yet, inside those gray, echoing halls, he was just another inmate. Another number in a system overflowing with broken men. Prison life at Walpole in the late 1960s was brutal. It was a place where violence simmered beneath every conversation, and survival depended on alliances. Guards were outnumbered, corruption was rampant, and inmates created their own hierarchy of power. DeSalvo, who had once commanded attention with his confessions, now found himself surrounded by men who didn't care about his notoriety, unless it could be used. At first, the other prisoners mocked him. "Hey, Strangler," they'd shout across the mess hall. "Who's next?" Some saw him as a celebrity, others as a fraud. In a world where dominance was currency, DeSalvo's reputation was both armor and target. He quickly learned to stay quiet, to observe. Despite his crimes, DeSalvo was not physically intimidating. He was soft-spoken, almost polite. He avoided fights, preferring to spend hours writing letters or talking with prison psychologists. His intelligence, however, earned him a strange sort of respect. He could fix things: radios, small electrical devices, anything mechanical. That skill gave him limited freedom to move around certain parts of the prison. During those early years, DeSalvo continued to insist, to anyone who would listen, that he had been the Boston Strangler. He spoke about it to fellow inmates, to guards, even to journalists who occasionally sent letters asking for interviews. But over time, his story began to shift. Details changed, and sometimes he contradicted his earlier confessions. That inconsistency made people wonder, was he starting to doubt his own lies, or was he slowly revealing the truth? Among those who visited him was George Nassar, his old cellmate, and the man who had first helped him connect with attorney F. Lee Bailey. Rumors spread that Nassar had used DeSalvo, feeding him crime scene details and encouraging him to confess for profit. The two men's relationship was complex, part friendship, part manipulation. In prison, they kept a wary distance, though some guards noticed them whispering during recreation time. By 1970, DeSalvo's fame outside prison had begun to fade, but inside Walpole, it continued to define him. He was often interviewed by psychiatrists studying criminal behavior. They described him as highly intelligent, but emotionally stunted, a man capable of rational thought, but detached from empathy. He could discuss murder as easily as describing a meal, detached, mechanical, but eerily precise. And yet, those who met him face to face often said he didn't feel dangerous. He had this strange calm, one prison doctor recalled, like he'd already made peace with his demons, or convinced himself they didn't exist. But beneath that calm exterior, something was shifting. DeSalvo began expressing fear, not of his past, but of what was happening around him. The prison had grown more violent, and he confided to friends that he believed someone wanted him dead. He spoke of inmates trying to silence him, of knowing too much. Whether that fear was real or imagined, no one could say for sure. Then came the letters. In 1973, DeSalvo wrote several letters to his psychiatrist, Dr. Ames Robbie, claiming he had new information, something that could change everything about the Boston Strangler case. "I want to tell the truth this time," he wrote, "but I can't do it here. It's not safe." He promised that if released or transferred to a safer facility, he would reveal what really happened, who was responsible for the killings, and why he had confessed. The letters were filled with cryptic statements, references to others involved, to things planted, and to a deal gone wrong. To investigators still haunted by the unanswered questions of the case. These claims were explosive. Was DeSalvo admitting he wasn't the Strangler after all? Or was he playing yet another manipulation game, trying to trade secrets for freedom? Before anyone could find out, tragedy struck. On the night of November 25, 1973, Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole State Prison. He had been stabbed 6 times in the chest. There were no signs of a struggle. His cell door had been locked from the outside. The murder weapon was never found. News of his death spread quickly through the prison and out into the world. To some, it felt like poetic justice, the killer of women finally meeting a violent end. But to others, it was a sign that someone wanted him silenced. Officially, the case was ruled a homicide, but the investigation went nowhere. No one was ever charged. Within weeks, the story of the Boston Strangler's death was front-page news once again, reigniting the old questions that had never truly been answered. Dr. Robbie, heartbroken by the loss, believed DeSalvo had been killed to prevent him from revealing the truth. He told me the day before his death that he had something to confess, not about what he did, but about what he didn't do. Robbie said in a later interview, F. Lee Bailey echoed that sentiment. "I never believed Albert acted alone," he said. "If he was the Strangler, he wasn't the only one." In the days after his death, DeSalvo's body was released to his family. He was buried quietly, far from the city that had once feared his name. His wife and children, who had endured years of shame and scrutiny, never spoke publicly again. But his death did not close the case. It reopened it. Investigators began re-examining old files, comparing crime scene details, and interviewing surviving witnesses. The inconsistencies that had been ignored during the trial now took on new weight. Could the murders have been committed by multiple men? Could someone else, perhaps even Nassar, have been involved? The questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. Behind the prison walls, the story of Albert DeSalvo became something between myth and warning. The tale of a man who sought infamy, found it, and was destroyed by it. His life behind bars, though short, revealed the hollow victory of fame built on falsehood. Whether he was the Boston Strangler or merely a man who wanted to be remembered as one, the result was the same: a legacy of terror, confusion, and death. In the end, Walpole did not rehabilitate him. It consumed him, just as the case itself had consumed Boston. As the years passed, his story would continue to evolve through books, documentaries, and endless debate. But in that prison cell, on that cold November night, Albert DeSalvo's voice went silent forever, and with it, perhaps, went the last real chance to know the truth about who, or what, the Boston Strangler really was. When the news of Albert DeSalvo's murder broke in late November 1973, Boston didn't react with relief. It reacted with confusion. The man who had confessed to being the Boston Strangler, the monster who had terrorized the city, was gone. But so, too, was the only person who might have been able to settle the truth once and for all. The case that had once united Boston in fear now divided it in doubt. Newspapers asked the question out loud: was DeSalvo really the Strangler? The police insisted the case was closed. After all, he had confessed in detail. But privately, detectives, psychiatrists, and even his own lawyer admitted that too many things didn't add up. For one, the modus operandi of the murders varied drastically. Some victims were strangled with stockings or cords, others with bare hands. Some were sexually assaulted, others were not. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 85. The crime scenes showed different levels of violence and different patterns of entry. It was almost as if multiple killers were at work, or a single, deeply inconsistent one. Then there was the question of evidence. No fingerprints, no fibers, no blood. Nothing ever physically tied DeSalvo to the murder scenes. His entire link to the crimes rested on his confessions, which were riddled with errors. In several cases, he described victims incorrectly or got the addresses wrong. Some of his descriptions matched details that had been widely reported in newspapers. Still, the public had believed, and that belief, once settled, was difficult to shake. After his death, George Nassar, DeSalvo's former cellmate and confidant, was questioned repeatedly. Many investigators suspected that Nassar, a convicted murderer himself, had manipulated DeSalvo into taking the blame. Nassar, intelligent and cunning, may have coached him with crime scene details in exchange for the promise of profit. He denied it, of course. Albert did what he did. Nassar told reporters, "He didn't need my help," but few believed him. The years following DeSalvo's death were filled with books, films, and documentaries trying to make sense of the mystery. Some painted DeSalvo as the lone killer, a disturbed man whose need for recognition led to horror. Others saw him as a scapegoat, a mentally fragile man exploited by a justice system desperate for closure. Psychiatrist Dr. Ames Robbie, one of the last people to correspond with DeSalvo, maintained until his own death that Albert was about to reveal something big before he was killed. He wanted to come clean, Roby said. He told me he'd lied, that he wasn't the Strangler, but he knew who was. If true, that confession died with him. In the decades that followed, Boston changed. The fear that once haunted the city's brownstone lined streets faded into history, replaced by skepticism. New generations grew up hearing the story as a cautionary tale, a mix of horror and uncertainty. The legend of the Boston Strangler became less about the murders themselves and more about the failures of investigation, psychology, and truth. Then, in the early 2000s, science brought new light to the case. With advancements in DNA testing, investigators decided to re-examine evidence from one of the final victims, Mary Sullivan, murdered in January 1964. Her case had always stood out. She was young, attractive, and her killing was unusually staged. Photos showed her body arranged on her bed, a scarf tied in a bow around her neck. For years, Mary's family refused to believe DeSalvo was responsible. They believed the true killer was still out there. Her nephew, Casey Sherman, even became a journalist and author, dedicating his life to proving DeSalvo's innocence. In 2001, DNA samples taken from Mary's remains were compared with saliva collected from a blanket and other items found at the scene. The results were inconclusive. The technology at the time was still limited, but it kept the debate alive. Then, in 2013, nearly 50 years after the murders, a breakthrough came. Massachusetts authorities obtained a DNA sample from DeSalvo's nephew, which shared enough genetic markers to suggest a close familial match to evidence from Mary Sullivan's murder scene. Shortly after, investigators exhumed DeSalvo's body for direct comparison. The results were definitive. The DNA found on Mary Sullivan's body matched Albert DeSalvo with near-perfect certainty. It was the evidence the case had always lacked. After decades of speculation, it seemed the science had spoken, at least for that one murder. But even this discovery didn't end the debate. Some experts argued that the DNA proved DeSalvo's involvement in Mary Sullivan's murder only, not the entire series. It doesn't make him the Boston Strangler, one criminologist said. It makes him one killer among possibly several. That distinction mattered because even if DeSalvo had killed Mary Sullivan, it didn't explain the discrepancies in the other cases. The differences in methods, victims, and timelines. It also didn't explain why DeSalvo had been so inconsistent in his confessions, or why he had described scenes that didn't match reality. For Mary Sullivan's family, though, the DNA brought closure. For others, it only deepened the mystery. The Boston Strangler case had become more than a series of murders. It had become a study in human perception. It showed how easily the desire for resolution could override the pursuit of truth. It revealed the flaws of 1960s forensic science, the danger of false confessions, and the psychological need to put a face to evil. Albert DeSalvo's name lived on, not only in the history books, but in the moral questions his story raised. Was he a killer seeking attention, or a broken man who took the blame for crimes he didn't commit? Was justice done, or was it simply convenient? Even today, criminologists study the Boston Strangler case as a cautionary example. They discuss how public panic can pressure police to find answers, how sensational media coverage can distort facts, and how a confession, without evidence, can sometimes be the weakest proof of all. In the end, the truth about the Boston Strangler may never be fully known. What remains is a haunting paradox. A man who confessed to crimes he may or may not have committed, and a city that chose certainty over complexity. Albert DeSalvo died without peace. Boston never found complete closure. And somewhere between those two truths lies the real story. Not of a killer, but of a society desperate to believe it had finally stopped one. The legend of the Boston Strangler still echoes in the city's history. In old police reports, in crime documentaries, and in the whispers of those who remember the fear that once lived in every locked door and dark hallway. But behind that legend stands one final, unshakable truth. Sometimes, the greatest mystery isn't who committed the crime, but why we needed someone to confess to it. By the early 1970s, the fear that once paralyzed Boston had begun to fade. The murders had stopped. The man accused of being the Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, was dead. But even in his absence, the story refused to die. In fact, it began to grow, not in courtrooms or police archives, but in newspapers, television specials, and eventually Hollywood films. The Strangler was no longer just a criminal. He was becoming a myth. In the decade after the killings, Americans were obsessed with understanding the darkness that lived among them. The 1960s had been a decade of assassinations, protests, and cultural upheaval. The Boston Strangler became a symbol, not only of violence, but of the hidden chaos lurking beneath the illusion of safety. The media had played a powerful role during the killings. Headlines in the Boston Globe and the Herald didn't just report the crimes. They amplified the terror. Words like and dominated the front pages. Photographs of victims, detailed descriptions of the crime scenes, and police sketches were printed day after day, feeding a city's panic. The more the press reported, the more the killer seemed to strike, almost as if he were reading the headlines himself. That cycle of fear and fascination turned the Boston Strangler into one of the first media-driven serial killer stories in modern American history. By the time DeSalvo confessed, the public already had a picture of the Strangler in their minds. A cunning, cold predator stalking women in their homes. His quiet demeanor and ordinary face only made the narrative more chilling. The media loved the irony. A man who looked so harmless could be the embodiment of evil. When DeSalvo was murdered in prison in 1973, the story gained its final tragic twist. It was a perfect arc for the press, a tale with fear, mystery, confession, and death. But that wasn't the end. The story's next life began on the silver screen. In 1968, even before DeSalvo's death, Hollywood released The Boston Strangler, directed by Richard Fletcher and starring Tony Curtis in a shockingly dark role. The film was stylish, cold, and deeply psychological. a reflection of both the real crimes and America's growing fascination with the criminal mind. Tony Curtis, best known for charming roles in comedies like Some Like It Hot, underwent a complete transformation. He dyed his hair dark, adopted a flat Boston accent, and portrayed DeSalvo as a man tormented by compulsions he couldn't understand. His performance was so unsettling that audiences could barely recognize him. Critics called it one of the most haunting performances in American cinema. The film took creative liberties, condensing timelines, dramatizing police investigations, and portraying DeSalvo as the definitive killer. It never questioned whether he was guilty, it assumed it. That creative choice shaped the public's memory for decades. The real story, the contradictions, the lack of evidence, the possibility of multiple killers, was overshadowed by the movie's clean narrative. Hollywood needed a villain, and Albert DeSalvo was perfect for the role. The film used innovative techniques for its time, split screens, showing multiple perspectives, eerie lighting, and a haunting score that echoed the city's paranoia. Viewers watched the Strangler's psychological breakdown unfold on screen. A man consumed by impulses, splitting his life between loving father and brutal murderer. When the Boston Strangler premiered, it drew both fascination and outrage. Some Bostonians felt it was too soon, too raw. Others saw it as cathartic, a way to process collective trauma through art. The movie made over $17 million, a significant success for its time, and cemented DeSalvo's name in popular culture forever. But with that success came distortion. The movie turned speculation into fact. It blurred the lines between reality and dramatization, giving future generations a version of the story that felt complete, even though it wasn't. Television and documentaries followed. Each decade brought new interpretations. In the 1980s and 1990s, crime shows like Unsolved Mysteries and A&E's American Justice revisited the case, questioning whether DeSalvo really was the Strangler. These programs introduced a new element, forensic skepticism. As DNA science evolved, so did the possibility that Hollywood and the courts had gotten it wrong. Books like The Boston Stranglers by Susan Kelly and A Rose for Mary by Casey Sherman reignited the debate. Kelly argued that multiple killers were responsible, while Sherman, Mary Sullivan's nephew, fought to clear DeSalvo's name. These works reframed the Strangler narrative, not as a closed case, but as a mystery still begging for truth. The modern retelling continued into the digital age. In 2023, Hulu released Boston Strangler, a film starring Keira Knightley as journalist Loretta McLaughlin, one of the real-life reporters who first connected the murders in the early 1960s. The movie shifted the focus away from the killer and toward the women who investigated him. It told the story through the lens of media, gender, and institutional failure, highlighting how female journalists uncovered what the police initially missed. This retelling symbolized how the narrative had evolved over time. In the 1960s, the Strangler had been portrayed as a monster, the embodiment of male fear and violence. By the 2020s, the focus had turned toward understanding how the story was told and who had the power to tell it. Through every retelling, from panic-driven headlines to psychological thrillers, one theme remained constant: the public's morbid fascination with evil hidden in plain sight. The Boston Strangler wasn't just a man or a case. He became a mirror reflecting society's deepest fears. Fear of vulnerability, of anonymity, of not knowing who to trust. The media had turned the murders into a spectacle, and Hollywood had transformed that spectacle into mythology. What began as a true crime investigation became a cultural obsession. A story retold so many times that the truth became almost irrelevant. And yet, beneath all the drama, one haunting reality endures behind the headlines, the films, and the fame. 13 women lost their lives. They were real people, daughters, mothers, sisters, whose stories were often overshadowed by the fascination with the man accused of killing them. In the end, the myth of the Boston Strangler says as much about us as it does about him. It shows how we create monsters to make sense of chaos, how we simplify horror into stories we can understand, and how, sometimes, the need for closure can turn truth into legend. From the flickering black and white news footage of 1962 to the streaming documentaries of the 2020s, the Boston Strangler has remained a fixture of American true crime culture. Not because we know what happened, but because we still don't. The cameras may have stopped rolling, the ink may have dried, but the fascination never faded. The story became more than murder. It became memory, myth, and mirror. And as long as people remain haunted by the question, who was the Boston Strangler? The legend will never die. In the shadow of the Boston Strangler's legend, there are names that too often fade into silence. Names of women whose lives ended in terror, but whose stories deserve more than to be remembered only as victims. They were daughters, mothers, friends, neighbors. They had laughter, routines, and dreams that never made the front pages. Yet their final moments became part of a headline that defined a city's darkest years. To understand the true weight of the Boston Strangler case, we must step away from the killer's mythology and walk, instead, into the quiet apartments and dimly lit hallways where 13 women lived their last hours. The story begins in the summer of 1962. Boston, a city known for its cobblestone streets and colonial charm, was about to be shaken by a fear it had never known. The first victim was Anna Sleezers, a 55-year-old Latvian immigrant and seamstress. On June 14, she was found in her apartment on Gainsborough Street. Her body positioned grotesquely, the belt from her robe knotted around her neck. The room was disturbingly neat. Nothing stolen, no signs of struggle. Whoever had done this had been calm, precise, deliberate. Anna's murder might have been dismissed as an isolated tragedy. But 2 weeks later, Mary Mullen, a 85-year-old woman, was found dead in her apartment. Initially believed to have suffered a heart attack, later investigation revealed evidence of strangulation. The pattern was emerging: women living alone, killed in their own homes. In late June, Nina Nichols, 68, a physical therapist, was discovered strangled with her own stockings in her luxurious apartment. The killer had left her carefully posed, as if mocking the line between intimacy and horror. The very next day, Helen Blake, a 65-year-old widow, was found murdered in her Lynn home, strangled with her nylon stockings. The similarities were unmistakable. The ligatures, the staging, the absence of robbery. The newspapers were beginning to connect the dots, and Boston's fear was starting to spread. Women began locking their doors, refusing to answer knocks, checking on each other daily. The city's heartbeat grew quick and uneasy. In August, Ida Irga, 75, was discovered strangled, her body left in a grotesque position. 2 days later, Jane Sullivan, 67, was found in her bathtub, also strangled. 6 women, all older, all living alone. The killer seemed to choose his victims not for who they were, but for what they represented. Vulnerability. And then the pattern shifted. In December 1962, the Strangler's violence took on a chilling new direction. His next victim was Sophie Clark, only 20 years old, young, educated, full of life. A bright African-American woman studying to become a nurse, Sophie broke the pattern of elderly victims. Her death shattered the theory that the killer was targeting older women. Boston now knew no one was safe. After Sophie came Patricia Bissett, 23, found strangled with her nylon stockings just before Christmas. Patricia was pregnant, a new lead, and worked as a secretary. Her death was the cruelest reminder, yet that the Strangler's victims weren't chosen by age or circumstance. They were chosen because they were women, alone and unaware that danger was about to step through their door. The following year, Mary Brown, 69, was killed, followed by Beverly Sammons, 23, who was also stabbed repeatedly. Beverly's case was especially gruesome. Her killer had escalated, mixing strangulation with stabbing, suggesting either a shift in the killer's psyche or possibly the work of another hand altogether. Then there was Evelyn Corbin, 58, found strangled in September 1963, and finally Mary Sullivan, 19 years old, the youngest and last known victim, discovered on January 4, 1964. Mary's death broke hearts across Boston. She was found seated on her bed, a scarf tied into a bow around her neck, a grim parody of innocence. A card and a mirror were left nearby, as if the killer wanted to be sure the city would remember her face. Each of these women had her own story before her life was reduced to a paragraph in the paper. Anna wrote letters to her son every week. Sophie was admired by her classmates and dreamed of working in hospitals that didn't discriminate. Mary Sullivan had recently moved to Boston, full of excitement about her new job at a phone company. They were not statistics. They were lives interrupted. Their murders forced the city to look inward. Women began carrying makeshift weapons. Locksmiths worked overtime. Apartment complexes started installing intercoms and security doors. Boston changed, not just in its skyline, but in its sense of safety. Yet, for decades, the focus remained almost entirely on the man accused of ending their lives. The media painted DeSalvo's face across front pages, while the names of the victims slowly slipped from public memory. Their individuality faded behind the shadow of a single nickname, the Boston Strangler. But in truth, their voices never stopped echoing. In later years, families of the victims, particularly those of Mary Sullivan, fought tirelessly to reclaim the narrative. They demanded forensic testing, challenged assumptions, and asked the question that haunted everyone. What if the wrong man confessed? Their persistence led to new DNA tests decades later, long after most of the public had moved on. The 2013 exhumation of Mary Sullivan's body revealed that the DNA found at the crime scene matched Albert DeSalvo. For her family, it was bittersweet closure. But for others, the question of multiple killers, or the possibility that DeSalvo was not responsible for all the murders, remained alive in many ways. The victims are the true center of the story. Though history too often remembers the violence more vividly than the lives it took, to revisit their stories is to feel the heartbeat of a city that mourned, that feared, and that struggled to find meaning in senseless loss. Boston eventually healed, at least on the surface. The streets filled again with laughter. The apartments were re-rented, and time carried people forward. But in the city's quiet corners, their memory lingers. In the apartments where curtains still flutter, in the sound of keys turning in locks, in the stories whispered by those who refuse to let their names fade away. Each woman's life tells us something vital about the era, about gender, safety, trust, and how society viewed women living alone. Their deaths sparked change in police procedure, public awareness, and the conversation around violence against women. To remember them is to confront what fear made the world forget. That behind every true crime story, there are lives worth more than the mystery that ended them. The Boston Strangler's legacy is one of terror, but the victim's legacy is one of resilience, of families who refused silence, of journalists who searched for truth, and of a city that learned to protect its own. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: even after 60 years, the victims' names, spoken aloud, carry more power than the killers ever will. Mary, Nina, Helen, Ida, Jane, Sophie, Patricia, Mary Brown, Beverly, Evelyn, Mary Sullivan. 13 women whose voices still echo through Boston's history, reminding us that evil may make headlines, but humanity endures. In the early 1960s, fear crept quietly through Boston's brownstone neighborhoods. It was not the loud, public fear of riots or political unrest that marked other American cities during that decade. It was intimate, private, and personal. It began inside locked apartments, behind drawn curtains, and in the hearts of women who suddenly realized that safety at home was an illusion. The Boston Strangler case did not just claim 13 lives. It altered how a generation of Americans thought, felt, and behaved. It redefined the boundaries of safety, trust, and even identity. It showed that evil could look ordinary, speak politely, and smile like a neighbor. And that realization changed the American mind forever. Before the Strangler, crime in Boston was something that happened out there, in dark alleys, rough neighborhoods, and places you could avoid if you were careful. But the Strangler brought violence home. His victims weren't on the streets. They were in their own apartments, where they felt secure. They were intelligent, cautious women who had every reason to believe they were safe behind locked doors. That was the horror. The Strangler didn't break into homes. He was invited in. Investigators believed he often posed as a handyman, delivery worker, or building inspector. Sometimes he simply knocked, introduced himself, and gained trust with charm or authority. Within minutes, he crossed from stranger to killer. The psychological impact of that pattern was devastating. In 1962 and 1963, Boston women began double, locking their doors, installing chains, and sleeping with the lights on. Some left notes for neighbors before going to bed. Small signs of life in case something happened during the night. Others adopted dogs, took self-defense classes, or moved in with relatives. Fear reshaped the way they lived. Even men began to feel it, though differently. Husbands worried about wives home alone. Policemen walked with a new intensity in their eyes. The city's energy shifted. Boston, known for its intellectual pride and historical dignity, now felt haunted. A place where terror lived behind every door. But it wasn't just Boston. The fear spread beyond city lines into suburbs and small towns across America. The image of an unknown man charming his way into homes struck at a primal fear. The idea that danger could be disguised as kindness. This realization marked a turning point in American psychology. Before the Strangler, the concept of the serial killer wasn't part of everyday vocabulary. There were murderers, yes, but they were usually seen as singularly motivated. Jealous lovers, vengeful enemies, greedy criminals. The Strangler didn't fit those molds. He killed without apparent reason or personal connection. His crimes were ritualistic, compulsive, and detached. Psychologists studying the case coined new terms to describe this kind of behavior. Words like sexual psychopath, sadistic compulsion, and or organized offender began entering forensic discussions. The Boston Strangler case became a dark classroom for criminal psychology. Dr. Robert K. Ressler, who would later coin the term serial killer, once said, "Cases like the Stranglers helped the FBI realize that such offenders weren't driven by anger or profit, but by obsession and ritual." The idea that someone could kill because they had to, not because they wanted to, was a chilling revelation. The case also exposed how police departments and the public underestimated psychological violence. In the early 1960s, sexual assault and domestic crimes were rarely discussed openly. The victims of the Strangler, most of them women, were often described by the press in ways that reflected society's biases. Living alone, divorced, independent, career women, subtly. The narrative implied that independence was dangerous. For many women, that message was suffocating. The Strangler didn't just terrorize the city physically. He reinforced social fears about female autonomy. Single women began to feel stigmatized. Some landlords refused to rent to them, claiming it was too risky. Families pressured daughters to move back home. The murders had created not just a wave of crime, but a cultural regression. Yet, paradoxically, this fear also sparked resilience. Neighborhood watch groups formed. Women began demanding better locks, safer apartments, and more respectful police treatment. Activists and journalists, including women like Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole, who first connected the murders in the press, started changing how the public talked about violence against women. The psychology of fear evolved into the psychology of awareness. Still, the city's collective trauma left scars. For years afterward, many Bostonians carried small habits born from those days. Double, checking the door before bed, avoiding eye contact with strangers in hallways, keeping a weapon near the nightstand. Some survivors of the era described an eerie silence that fell over neighborhoods after sunset, as if the city itself held its breath. In psychological terms, Boston experienced a form of communal PTSD, a lasting anxiety triggered by the randomness of evil. People learned to fear not just what lurked in the dark, but what smiled in the daylight. The case also forced law enforcement to confront their own mental frameworks. Detectives accustomed to looking for rational motives found themselves chasing something they couldn't understand. The idea that a killer might have no emotional connection to his victims, that he could be methodical, intelligent, and yet utterly detached, broke traditional investigative logic. This was the birth of modern behavioral profiling. The fear that once paralyzed Boston became the foundation for new disciplines in criminology, psychology, and forensic science. The city's pain, in a grim way, taught America how to study the mind of a killer. And yet, beneath the academic analysis and psychological theories, the emotional truth remained simple and human. Fear had made people feel powerless. It invaded their routines, their confidence, and their relationships. The Strangler's legacy wasn't just in the deaths he caused, but in the way he altered the rhythm of everyday life. Even decades later, survivors of that time describe it not just as a period of crime, but as an atmosphere, a tension that hung in the air, invisible but heavy, a sense that anyone could be next, that no lock, no light, no logic could protect you from the unknown. That psychological wound shaped not only Boston, but the broader American psyche. It changed the way people thought about safety, privacy, and trust. Lessons that still echo in today's true crime culture, where fascination with killers is as strong as the fear they once inspired. The Boston Strangler taught a chilling truth that America has never forgotten. Evil is not always a shadow on the street. Sometimes it's a face that smiles before it strikes. By early 1964, Boston had become a city trapped between fear and frustration. 13 women were dead. The newspapers screamed for answers. Politicians demanded results. And the Boston Police Department, stretched thin, criticized, and exhausted, found itself at the center of a nightmare it couldn't contain. What began as a criminal investigation was quickly spiraling into a public relations war. Each new murder was a headline. Each day without an arrest was a failure. Behind closed doors, detectives argued. Agencies clashed, and evidence vanished in the fog of confusion. The Boston Strangler case wasn't just a story of murder. It was a story of how fear can fracture even those sworn to stop it. From the start, the investigation was chaotic. 13 victims meant 13 crime scenes, scattered across Boston, Cambridge, and surrounding suburbs. Different jurisdictions, different detectives, and different procedures. There was no centralized task force, no unified command. Each department guarded its evidence like territory. Detective Phil DiNatale, one of the lead investigators, later admitted that communication was almost non-existent. Police departments in the 1960s weren't built for multi-jurisdictional investigations. Each case was handled separately until the pattern became too obvious to ignore. By the time authorities realized the murders were connected, vital evidence had already been lost. Worse yet, crime scene protocol was primitive by today's standards. Officers walked through apartments without gloves. Neighbors crowded hallways and evidence, fibers, fingerprints, footprints, was often compromised before it could be analyzed. As the murders mounted, so did public panic. Women's groups demanded curfews, and local newspapers began publishing speculative profiles of the killer. A sexual deviant, a sadist, perhaps even a medical professional. The theories were endless, and mostly wrong. The pressure on law enforcement became unbearable. The police commissioner and the mayor faced daily criticism. Boston's image as a proud, historic city was being eclipsed by headlines of horror. The press had given the killer a name, the Boston Strangler, and that name became a curse the city couldn't shake. In desperation, the police launched one of the largest manhunts in Massachusetts history. Over 5,000 suspects were interviewed. Psychiatrists were consulted. Door-to-door searches were conducted. Every man with a record of sexual assault or breaking and entering was brought in for questioning. But the truth was simple: they were searching in the dark. And then, in 1964, something unexpected happened. A man named Albert DeSalvo was arrested, not for murder, but for a series of bizarre home invasions and sexual assaults. His crimes earned him a new nickname in the press: the Measuring Man. He would enter women's apartments under the pretense of being a modeling agent or repairman, measure their bodies, and then assault them before fleeing. It was disturbing, yes, but not murder. Still, the details caught the attention of detectives and psychologists. DeSalvo's calm demeanor, his charm, his ability to talk his way into apartments, it all sounded eerily familiar. When he was later caught again for a string of violent assaults dubbed the Green Man crimes, investigators began to see a larger pattern. While in custody, DeSalvo began talking. To his cellmate, George Nassar, he confessed to something far darker, that he was the Boston Strangler. Nassar, a cunning career criminal, told his lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, who saw an opportunity to make legal history. Bailey met with DeSalvo, listened to his story, and soon realized he might be representing the most infamous man in America. The confession was stunning. DeSalvo described crime scenes in chilling detail: the positioning of bodies, the ligatures used, the items left behind. He knew things that had never been released to the public. He could recall the interiors of apartments, the color of walls, even the victim's clothing. It was almost too perfect. The police, desperate for closure, believed they had finally found their man. The confession tied together the chaos. It gave the city something it hadn't had in years: a sense of resolution. But there was a problem. Several, in fact. DeSalvo had never been charged with murder. There was no physical evidence linking him to any of the crime scenes. No fingerprints. No DNAs, which didn't yet exist in forensic testing. No witnesses placing him near the victims. Only his words. And his words were inconsistent. In some confessions, he described victims who didn't exist. In others, he confused details or misremembered times and places. When asked to lead investigators to certain apartments, he hesitated or gave vague directions. Psychiatrists who interviewed him described a man with a remarkable memory, but also a strong desire for attention and validation. To some, it looked like guilt. To others, it looked like performance. There were rumors that George Nassar might have coached him, feeding him details in exchange for leniency or notoriety. Others believed DeSalvo had read about the crimes in the press and filled in the blanks himself. F. Lee Bailey, while representing him, openly admitted that DeSalvo might be mentally disturbed, but insisted his confessions were credible. For the public, they had a name, a face, and a story. The terror finally had an ending. In 1967, DeSalvo was sentenced, not for the murders, but for the sexual assaults that had led to his arrest. He received life in prison. The state never tried him for the stranglings. Still, everyone called him the Boston Strangler. Behind the scenes, though, not everyone was convinced. Several detectives and prosecutors quietly doubted the confession. The crime scenes were too varied. Some victims were strangled with stockings, others stabbed. Some showed evidence of sexual assault, others did not. The killer's methods and patterns changed repeatedly. Could one man have done all of this? The deeper investigators looked, the more the theory unraveled. Some experts began to suspect that there had been more than one killer. Perhaps a copycat inspired by the media frenzy. The police had been under immense pressure to find someone, anyone, to calm the public. And in that climate, DeSalvo's confession fit too neatly. As the years passed, cracks in the case widened into chasms. The so-called resolution began to look like a cover-up, or at least a desperate act of self-preservation by a city that could no longer stand its own fear. When DeSalvo was murdered in prison in 1973, stabbed to death under mysterious circumstances, it seemed as though the final page had been written. But his death only deepened the mystery. Why was he killed? Who wanted him silenced? And did he die knowing the truth? That he had confessed to crimes he may not have committed. The Boston Strangler case was supposed to end with justice. Instead, it ended with more questions than answers. The investigation, once hailed as a victory, became a symbol of flawed police work, broken communication, and the dangers of confessions born in confinement. Boston had its closure, but not its truth. When Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, Boston exhaled for the first time in years. Fear loosened its grip, and the city, desperate for peace, accepted the story without hesitation. The newspapers called it the end of terror. But beneath that relief was a problem. The confession didn't quite fit. The deeper investigators, psychologists, and journalists dug, the more they realized Albert DeSalvo's story was full of cracks. Some details were right, others were wrong, wildly wrong. And as time passed, the cracks widened until the whole narrative of the Boston Strangler began to crumble. When DeSalvo confessed in 1965, he was already infamous as the Measuring Man and the Green Man, a serial sexual predator who had assaulted dozens of women across Massachusetts. His crimes showed organization, manipulation, and an alarming lack of empathy. But murder, that was another level entirely. Still, his confession seemed detailed enough to convince many. He spoke softly, methodically, recounting the killings one by one to psychiatrists, detectives, and his attorney, F. Lee Bailey. He described the victims' appearances, the way he entered their homes, even the items used as ligatures. But when investigators fact-checked his stories, inconsistencies piled up. In one case, DeSalvo misidentified the color of a victim's hair. In another, he couldn't remember the layout of her apartment. He described scenes that contradicted the autopsy reports. At times, he seemed to mix multiple murders into one composite memory. And when pressed for more details, he hesitated, as if searching for cues. Some detectives believed he had learned the information secondhand, perhaps from his cellmate George Nassar or through newspaper reports. By then, the Strangler case had been sensationalized across the country. Crime scene photos, victim biographies, and investigative tidbits had all leaked to the press. Anyone with a sharp memory and a flair for drama could have pieced together a convincing narrative. F. Lee Bailey, who would later defend figures like O.J., Simpson, and Sam Shepard, saw the case as both a legal and psychological puzzle. He believed DeSalvo's confession was sincere, a symptom of an overwhelming compulsion to unburden himself. Bailey wanted to use the case to argue for an insanity defense and expose flaws in the legal system's treatment of mentally ill offenders. But the court never gave him that chance. DeSalvo wasn't charged with murder, and no trial was ever held to test the confession in front of a jury. It existed only as a story, a haunting monologue recorded on tape, transcribed in court documents, and replayed endlessly by the media. Over time, skepticism grew. The most prominent critic was Susan Kelly, a journalist and author who spent years studying police reports and interviewing detectives. In her groundbreaking 1996 book, The Boston Stranglers, Kelly argued that DeSalvo could not have committed all 13 murders, and possibly hadn't committed any. She uncovered inconsistencies in police files, missing evidence, and even untested fingerprints. Her conclusion was stark: the Boston Strangler was not one man, but several. According to Kelly, the murders shared superficial similarities: strangulation, female victims, domestic settings, but differed in almost every forensic detail. The killer's methods changed from crime to crime. Some victims were sexually assaulted, others were not. Some were posed, others weren't. Some were strangled with stockings, others with belts, scarves, or ropes. To Kelly and others, it seemed implausible that one person would vary his methods so drastically unless he was deliberately trying to confuse investigators. More likely, they argued, The intense media coverage had created a copycat effect. Multiple offenders, each aware of the Strangler headlines, may have mimicked the signature to disguise their own crimes. Even retired detectives began admitting doubts. Detective Phil Di Natale, who once helped gather evidence against DeSalvo, privately questioned whether the confession had been too convenient. "We wanted it to be him," he said in one interview. "We needed it to be him." Psychiatrists who interviewed DeSalvo described a man deeply disturbed but not delusional. He craved recognition. He had spent his life invisible, a poor kid from Chelsea, a petty thief, a man who drifted from job to job. The Strangler confession gave him something he'd never had before: importance. Some experts believed his confession was a cry for identity. By claiming to be the most feared man in America, he became unforgettable. In his mind, notoriety was redemption, a way to matter even in infamy. Then there was George Nassar, DeSalvo's cellmate, the man who first alerted Attorney Bailey about the confession. Nassar had a genius-level IQ and a reputation for manipulation. Many suspected that he had coached DeSalvo, feeding him details in exchange for potential financial reward or leniency. Nassar, of course, denied it, but his fingerprints linger in every version of the story. Years later, even F. Lee Bailey began to express unease. Though he never fully recanted his belief in DeSalvo's guilt, he admitted that the lack of physical evidence and the inconsistencies in his client's statements raised uncomfortable questions. By the 1990s, those questions had grown into a storm. Advances in DNA technology offered a chance to test biological evidence from the original crime scenes. Something unthinkable in the 1960s. Families of the victims, especially that of Mary Sullivan, the youngest and final known victim, pushed for testing to confirm once and for all whether DeSalvo had told the truth. In 2001, the first DNA tests yielded inconclusive results. But in 2013, a major breakthrough changed everything. Forensic experts tested DNA from a water bottle DeSalvo's nephew had discarded and compared it to seminal fluid found on Mary Sullivan's blanket. The result was nearly irrefutable, a 99.9% match. For the first time, science confirmed that Albert DeSalvo had been at least partially truthful. He was indeed the killer of Mary Sullivan. But the relief was short-lived. The other 12 murders showed no such proof. Many still lacked biological evidence altogether. The truth had fractured into two realities. DeSalvo was the killer in one case, but perhaps not in others. This revelation deepened the controversy instead of ending it. If DeSalvo had killed Mary Sullivan, had he also killed the rest? Or had multiple predators stalked Boston in those years, each exploiting the fear, each hiding behind the name the media had invented? The confession controversy became more than a question of guilt. It became a reflection of human psychology, of how badly we want closure, how easily we accept a neat ending even when the facts are messy. The city, the police, and the public had needed a story that made sense. Albert DeSalvo provided that story. Whether it was true or not almost didn't matter anymore. The case revealed the fragility of truth under pressure, how fear, politics, and desperation can build a narrative stronger than evidence. DeSalvo's confession was both a revelation and a trap. It calmed a city, but it buried the truth beneath convenience. In the end, the Boston Strangler story became less about one man's guilt and more about society's need for answers. It's easier to believe in one monster than in the chaos of many. It's easier to close a case than to live with uncertainty. And so, Albert DeSalvo, flawed, forgotten, perhaps only half guilty, became the symbol of an era's terror and the embodiment of a confession that may have been more myth than reality. For decades, the Boston Strangler case lingered in limbo, trapped between confession and doubt, myth and evidence. The name Albert DeSalvo had become synonymous with evil. Yet the truth about who really murdered those women remained uncertain. It wasn't until the rise of modern forensic science that the long-dormant case would finally awaken, forcing everyone, police, families, and historians, to confront what technology could now reveal. In the early 2000s, a quiet revolution was unfolding in crime labs across America. DNA testing, once a futuristic idea, had become a powerful tool capable of linking or excluding suspects with stunning precision. The Boston Strangler case, long considered unresolvable, suddenly had a new hope. Forensic scientists and investigators revisited the old evidence files, stored for decades in dusty police archives. They searched through boxes of photographs, autopsy notes, clothing, and microscopic slides. Much of it had degraded over time. Biological samples, crucial for DNA comparison, were scarce. In the 1960s, police had not preserved evidence with future genetic testing in mind. Still, a few fragments remained. Among them, a piece of cloth from the 1964 murder of Mary Sullivan. Mary Sullivan's case was particularly tragic. She was the last known victim of the Boston Strangler. A 19-year-old woman found dead in her Charles Street apartment on January 4, 1964. Her body had been arranged grotesquely on her bed, with a scarf tied around her neck and a greeting card placed nearby, almost like a signature. She was the youngest victim, and her murder had shocked even hardened detectives. Her family had never believed that Albert DeSalvo was her killer. For years, her nephew, Casey Sherman, became her voice, determined to uncover the truth through science rather than confession. He gathered every available report, every piece of forensic evidence, and pushed relentlessly for modern DNA testing. By 2001, scientists at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory began testing biological material from the Sullivan case. The results were frustrating. The samples were too degraded, the technology too limited. The DNA could not be conclusively matched to anyone. The mystery persisted, but forensic science doesn't stand still. Over the next decade, DNA technology advanced exponentially. By 2013, techniques for extracting genetic material from old, degraded samples had improved dramatically. Investigators revisited Mary Sullivan's evidence one last time. They located seminal fluid stains preserved on a piece of her blanket and used the latest methods to isolate a usable DNA profile. At the same time, they needed a modern sample to compare it against. Albert DeSalvo had been dead since 1973, stabbed to death in prison under mysterious circumstances. But his family was still alive, and DNA could be extracted from a close relative. Investigators obtained a sample from one of his nephews through a discarded water bottle, legally collected as abandoned property. The results came back within weeks, and they were stunning. The DNA from the crime scene matched DeSalvo's nephew's DNA so closely that the statistical probability of error was less than 1 in several billion. The scientists concluded that the DNA found on Mary Sullivan's blanket could have come only from Albert DeSalvo or his identical male relative. The news exploded across the nation. After 50 years of doubt, science had finally spoken. DeSalvo was conclusively linked to the murder of Mary Sullivan. Boston Police Commissioner Edward F. Davis announced the findings in a press conference, calling it a major step toward finally resolving one of Boston's darkest chapters. To remove any lingering doubt, investigators obtained a warrant to exhume DeSalvo's body from his grave in Peabody, Massachusetts. The exhumation took place in July 2013 under intense media coverage. Forensic scientists extracted DNA directly from DeSalvo's remains and compared it to the crime scene evidence. The match was absolute. There was no longer any question. Albert DeSalvo had killed Mary Sullivan. The revelation brought both relief and confusion. On one hand, families of the victims could finally claim a degree of closure. On the other, the confirmation reignited a haunting question. If DeSalvo was guilty of Sullivan's murder, did that mean he had also killed the others? The DNA evidence was clear only for one victim. For the other 12, the trail remained cold. In some cases, biological evidence had been lost or destroyed. In others, the material was too degraded for modern testing. The Boston Strangler story still had missing pieces. Forensic analysts began examining the crime scene photos and reports from each of the murders, looking for patterns that might point to a single perpetrator. The results were mixed. Some killings bore clear similarities: sexual assault, manual strangulation, and the use of the victim's clothing as ligatures. But others deviated significantly. One woman had been stabbed. Another had not been sexually assaulted. Several victims showed no signs of forced entry, while others did. The inconsistencies seemed to confirm what many experts had suspected for years. The Boston Strangler might never have been one man at all. DNA analysis provided new context for those suspicions. In 2014, cold case experts from the Massachusetts State Police and Boston Police Department conducted an exhaustive forensic review of all 13 murders. They concluded that while DeSalvo was, most likely, responsible for several of the killings, he could not be definitively tied to all of them. Psychological profiling further complicated the picture. According to FBI behavioral analysts, the pattern of escalation, from older victims to younger ones, from strangulation to sexual assault, could suggest more than one offender operating under the same signature. Alternatively, DeSalvo might have evolved as a killer, adapting his methods over time. Science had given answers, but it had also deepened the mystery. For Mary Sullivan's family, the DNA confirmation was bittersweet. "We have truth, but not peace," said her nephew Casey Sherman. "Because while we know who killed Mary, the other families still live without answers, and Boston still lives with ghosts." The Boston Strangler case became a landmark in the history of forensic science, a symbol of how technology can resurrect justice from the past. It also became a cautionary tale about over-reliance on confessions and the fallibility of human investigation. Without DNA, Albert DeSalvo's confession might have remained the only evidence, forever questioned, forever incomplete. In classrooms and crime labs today, the Boston Strangler investigation is taught as a pivotal moment, a story that bridges the gap between old-fashioned detective work and the precision of molecular forensics. It shows how science can strip away decades of speculation and illuminate a truth buried by time. Yet even with DNA, not every mystery can be solved. Some of the Strangler's victims remain beyond the reach of modern science. Their killers, if not DeSalvo, may have died decades ago, their secrets taken to the grave. The legacy of the Boston Strangler is therefore twofold. It is both a triumph of forensic innovation and a reminder of the limits of knowledge. DNA proved one man's guilt, but left open the possibility that evil had more than one face in 1960s Boston. For the city that once trembled behind locked doors, science had brought a measure of closure, but not complete peace. By the mid-1960s, Boston was a city consumed by fear. The phrase, Boston Strangler, wasn't just a headline, it was a warning, whispered in every neighborhood, every household, every dimly lit stairwell. The murders of 13 women, each one strangled in her own home, had created an atmosphere of panic that extended far beyond the crime scenes. Locks were changed, doors were bolted, and men who once left their wives home alone refused to do so anymore. Women carried scissors or kitchen knives in their handbags. Hardware stores couldn't keep door chains in stock. In that environment of widespread fear, rumor and speculation became as dangerous as the killer himself. The public craved answers, and the police, under intense pressure, wanted results. When Albert DeSalvo's confession emerged, it provided a convenient explanation for an otherwise chaotic pattern of killings. But as the decades passed, and forensic science began to re-examine the evidence, new questions arose, and with them came theories that challenged the official narrative. One of the most persistent theories is that there was never just one Boston Strangler. Instead, multiple offenders may have been operating at the same time, each taking advantage of the city's terror. The theory first gained traction among detectives who worked the original cases. Many of them noticed inconsistencies in the killer's method of operation. Some victims were elderly, others were young. Some were sexually assaulted, others were not. The strangulation techniques varied. In one case, the killer used a bow-like knot. In another, he tied the ligature in a simple loop. There were differences in entry methods too. Some apartments showed signs of forced entry, while others had none, suggesting that the victims may have known their killer or willingly let him in. These contradictions baffled investigators, even at the time. It was like chasing a ghost that kept changing faces. One retired Boston detective later said, "The multiple killer theory proposes that the original Strangler murders, the first few, may have been committed by one individual, possibly a sexual psychopath, while later killings were the work of opportunists or copycats, mimicking the media's descriptions. The press had reported every gruesome detail, the ligatures, the poses, the victims' demographics. Those details became a blueprint for any disturbed mind seeking attention or power. Psychologists have long studied this phenomenon, known as the copycat effect, where media coverage of violent crimes inspires imitation. It's rooted in the human desire for notoriety and control. When the Boston Strangler became a national obsession, it wasn't just a criminal identity, it was a legend. For someone already on the edge, it was an identity to claim. The result, according to some criminologists, was a kind of murder contagion between 1962 and 1964, while police scrambled to identify one suspect. The myth of the Strangler gave cover to other killers. Each new murder reinforced the idea that one unstoppable predator was on the loose, when in reality, several may have been hiding in plain sight. Supporting this theory are the findings from modern criminological analysis. In 2014, FBI behavioral experts reviewed the case and noted that the killings did not display the usual escalation pattern typical of serial killers. Most murderers of this type evolve over time, refining their methods, becoming more consistent. The Boston murders, however, seemed less consistent as they went on, as if different hands were involved. Then there's the psychological angle. Albert DeSalvo's background fits the profile of a violent sexual offender, but not necessarily that of a compulsive killer. He was a manipulative con man, capable of assault and control, but his past crimes lacked the homicidal impulse that defines most serial murderers. Psychiatrists who interviewed him, including Dr. Ames Robe, believed DeSalvo's confession stemmed from a craving for recognition, not from genuine guilt. So, if not DeSalvo alone, then who else might have been responsible? Some investigators have pointed to George Nassar, DeSalvo's brilliant but sociopathic prison acquaintance. Nassar had a documented history of violence and murder. He was also manipulative enough to exploit DeSalvo's weaknesses, possibly coaching him to confess in exchange for publicity or profit. The idea that Nassar himself might have committed some of the murders has persisted for decades, though no concrete evidence ties him directly to any of the Strangler victims. Another theory involves copycat killers within the Boston area, men who shared similar sexual compulsions and acted during the height of the Strangler panic. Because the police were focused entirely on the one-man narrative, these offenders may have operated undetected, their crimes mistakenly attributed to the Strangler legend. Still others believe that at least one of the murders could have been a domestic homicide, disguised as part of the serial pattern. In some cases, evidence suggested the victims may have known their attackers. The Strangler hysteria provided a convenient cover, a way for a killer to deflect suspicion by making his crime look like part of a larger spree. As the years passed, These theories became more than speculation. They became part of the case's enduring legacy. Books, documentaries, and even films explored every angle, from conspiracy to psychological manipulation. Each new interpretation reflected a deeper truth about human fear and the hunger for closure. The psychology of the Strangler case wasn't limited to the killer. It infected the entire city. Forensic psychologists studying the period often describe Boston as suffering from collective trauma. Fear was so pervasive that it altered daily behavior. Women refused to go out alone, bars closed earlier, and neighborhoods that once felt safe became tense and suspicious. Police, too, fell prey to the psychological weight. The public pressure to catch the killer led to rushed conclusions, questionable interrogations, and the acceptance of circumstantial evidence. Investigators were haunted not only by the crimes themselves, but by the immense scrutiny of a city desperate for safety. The Strangler hysteria changed Boston's relationship with crime forever. It reshaped the city's understanding of vulnerability, gender, and trust. For many women, it was a brutal awakening to the dangers of their own homes. The realization that safety was an illusion even behind locked doors. When the truth began to unravel decades later, when scientists revealed that DeSalvo was definitively tied to one murder, but possibly not the others, Boston had to face a chilling thought: the rest of the killers may never have been caught. That uncertainty remains part of the city's DNA. The case taught investigators valuable lessons about the influence of the media, the dangers of tunnel vision, and the need for patience in forensic investigation. It also showed how fear, when unchecked, can shape a narrative more powerful than fact. The Boston Strangler may have been one man, or he may have been many. But what endures is the legacy of fear he left behind. A reminder that evil can thrive in confusion, and that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what we know, but what we can never prove. The Boston Strangler was not born in the shadows of an alley or the confines of a killer's mind. He was born in the headlines. From the moment the first strangulation case hit the newspapers in 1962, the media transformed Boston's tragedy into a national obsession. Each new murder was front-page news, each lurid detail broadcast across radio and television. Reporters gave the nameless killer an identity, a signature, and a legend: the Boston Strangler. It was a name that stuck, one that carried a strange rhythm, both chilling and unforgettable. Within weeks, it became synonymous with terror. Women feared it, men whispered it, the police despised it, and the media fed on it. What began as a series of local murders quickly evolved into a sensational saga. Journalists, desperate for readership, described the crimes with graphic precision: how victims were found, how the knots were tied, even how their bodies were positioned. In doing so, they inadvertently gave other potential offenders a guidebook. And the myth of a single unstoppable killer grew larger than the evidence ever supported. By late, headlines screamed of the Phantom Killer of Boston. The city's major papers, the Boston Globe, the Record American, and the Herald, competed for the most dramatic angle. Television networks aired nightly updates with ominous music and shadowed reenactments. What the media didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care to acknowledge, was that they were not merely reporting the story, they were shaping it. In a city already gripped by fear, every rumor became a lead, every sound in the night a potential threat. Anonymous tips flooded the police lines by the hundreds. Some citizens reported seeing strange men near laundry rooms or apartment hallways. Others described mysterious phone calls, odd smells, or footsteps outside their doors. The media turned the killer into an almost supernatural figure, omnipresent, invisible, and intelligent. Headlines suggested he could slip through locked doors or disguise himself as a maintenance man, a delivery worker, or even a police officer. The idea that no woman was safe anywhere became the narrative of the time. Boston's psychological atmosphere was suffocating. Reporters interviewed terrified residents, broadcasting their fear directly into America's living rooms. In one particularly haunting radio segment, a woman said through tears, "You can't even trust your own doorknob anymore." As hysteria spread, the coverage took on a tone that mixed morality and voyeurism. The victims were often described in ways that subtly blamed them for living alone, for opening the door to strangers, for being too trusting. Such portrayals reflected the gender biases of the era, turning the Strangler case into not just a story of murder, but a commentary on the changing roles of women in society. During the early 1960s, more women were living independently, pursuing careers, and moving into urban apartments without husbands or families. The Strangler's victims, mostly single women, represented this new social freedom. To a conservative post-war America, their deaths became a cautionary tale. The message, whispered between the lines, was chilling independence could be deadly. This framing sold newspapers, but distorted reality. It fueled a myth of vulnerability that reinforced fear rather than empowerment. Sociologists later called it a form of moral panic, a phenomenon where media coverage amplifies danger, creating the illusion of a greater threat than actually exists. At the height of the hysteria, sales of home security devices surged. Locksmiths made small fortunes. Gun shops reported record sales. Women formed neighborhood watch groups, often patrolling in pairs. Boston's crime rate for unrelated offenses actually dropped. Not because the streets were safer, but because the population was too afraid to leave home. When Albert DeSalvo eventually confessed, the media once again seized control of the narrative. His face was everywhere: newspapers, magazines, television specials. The public finally had an image to attach to the fear that had haunted them. Reporters described him as ordinary, polite, even handsome, heightening the horror of his alleged crimes. Yet, as details of his confession emerged, inconsistencies appeared. Some journalists began to question whether DeSalvo was telling the truth. Others dismissed those doubts, preferring the comfort of a neatly packaged ending. The story of the Boston Strangler had become too big to unravel. Hollywood soon joined the frenzy. In 1968, just a few years after DeSalvo's confession, the film The Boston Strangler, starring Tony Curtis and Henry Fonda, brought the case to the big screen. The movie portrayed DeSalvo as the tortured, split personality killer, dramatizing his crimes with unsettling intensity. Though it was loosely based on fact, it blurred the line between history and fiction even further. The film's release cemented the Strangler's place in American pop culture. He was no longer just a criminal. He was a mythic figure, part of the dark folklore of modern America, standing alongside Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer. But behind that myth were real women, real families, real grief, and for them, the media's portrayal often felt exploitative. Victims, relatives, complained that journalists had sensationalized their loved ones' deaths, turning private tragedies into public entertainment. As years passed, the tone of coverage shifted. The once celebrated end of terror narrative gave way to doubt and introspection when DNA testing in the 2000s revealed that DeSalvo was definitively linked to only one murder. Mary Sullivan. The same media that had glorified his confession now dissected its flaws. Documentaries, podcasts, and retrospectives revisited the case, asking whether Boston had been missiled by its own need for closure. The truth was uncomfortable. The media's hunger for drama had helped build a monster that may never have truly existed in the way the headlines suggested. The story of the Boston Strangler became, in many ways, a story about storytelling. How narratives of fear are constructed, sold, and believed. It showed how easily facts can be shaped by perception, and how the need for a villain can sometimes outweigh the need for the truth. Today, when crime documentaries and true crime podcasts revisit the case, they often do so with a tone of regret, an acknowledgement that the media's role in fueling panic was as much a part of the tragedy as the murders themselves. The Boston Strangler may have been one man, or several, but without the newspapers, without the cameras, without the breathless headlines, he might never have become a legend. And in that sense, the Boston Strangler was not only a creation of crime, but of the story that was told about it. The story of the Boston Strangler did not end with Albert DeSalvo's death, nor with his confession, nor even with the supposed resolution of the case. It continued to haunt Boston long after the headlines faded, like an echo that refused to quiet. For a city once paralyzed by fear, the legacy of those dark years became a mirror, reflecting not only what happened, but what it meant. In the decades following DeSalvo's death in 1973, the case became a cornerstone of true crime history, taught in criminology classes and revisited in countless documentaries. It represented the convergence of fear, psychology, and the failure of a system trying to understand evil. Yet, as time passed, one truth grew clearer. The mystery of the Boston Strangler was not fully solved. For years, police officers and journalists wrestled with the contradictions. DeSalvo's confessions, though detailed, contained errors. Some crime scenes didn't match his descriptions. The victims varied too widely in age, background, and location for all to belong to one killer. The pattern, the supposed signature, looked more like the product of several minds rather than one. And still, the public wanted a single answer. The human mind, uncomfortable with chaos, demands order. It seeks one name, one face, one story. The idea of multiple killers roaming Boston during the same years was too unsettling to accept. DeSalvo became that necessary closure. The villain everyone could blame, even if the evidence was imperfect. It wasn't until decades later, in 2013, that science entered where psychology had failed. DNA testing linked Albert DeSalvo to the murder of Mary Sullivan, the last known victim of the Boston Strangler series. The match was undeniable, a genetic fingerprint preserved across 50 years. For many, that confirmation felt like justice at last. But for others, it raised even more questions. If DeSalvo's DNA was only found at one scene, what about the rest? Who killed the others? Was the term Boston Strangler ever truly accurate, or merely a convenient label for a cluster of unsolved homicides? That uncertainty became the enduring mystery, a haunting reminder that truth in crime is rarely neat. The legacy of the Boston Strangler is not just in the murders themselves, but in the ripples they left behind. In Boston, the case reshaped how people thought about safety, privacy, and trust. Apartment doors that were once left open became locked. Women who once welcomed maintenance men now checked for identification twice. The city learned that danger could come dressed in normalcy. For law enforcement, the case forced a reckoning with investigative flaws. At the time, Boston's police departments were fragmented. Jurisdictional boundaries blurred, communication faltered, and vital information was lost between precincts. The Strangler case became a painful example of how disorganization could cost lives. In later years, the tragedy inspired reforms in criminal investigation, particularly in the use of behavioral profiling and interdepartmental coordination. It also spurred advancements in forensic science as the inadequacies of the 1960s became clear. By the 1990s and 2000s, DNA technology revolutionized cold case work, offering hope where memory had failed. But perhaps the greatest lesson was psychological. The Boston Strangler era exposed society's vulnerability to fear. In the early 1960s, Boston was not only terrified of the killer, it was terrified of itself. The murders shattered the illusion of safety in one of America's oldest and most intellectual cities. No amount of education or social standing could protect against random violence. That fear reshaped Boston's identity. The city became more guarded, more suspicious, and more aware of its own shadows. Yet, in time, it also became more resilient. Survivors, victims' families, and citizens who lived through that terror carried a shared memory that united them. Not in fear, but in endurance. When the city revisited the case in later decades, it did so not with hysteria, but reflection. Memorials and documentaries began to focus less on the killer and more on the women whose lives were lost. Their stories, once overshadowed by the Strangler's myth, were finally given space. They were mothers, daughters, friends, teachers, nurses, women who represented an entire generation's fight for independence and dignity. And in that reframing, something profound happened. The victims began to reclaim their narratives from the man who had stolen them. The Boston Strangler's story also became a symbol for the dangers of media sensationalism. The frenzy of coverage, the dramatized headlines, the public panic, all served as a warning about the power of storytelling to shape reality. It reminded future journalists and documentarians that truth demands responsibility, that empathy must outweigh spectacle. Even today, in an era of podcasts, streaming documentaries, and social media investigations, the lessons of the Strangler case echo loudly. The line between fact and fascination remains fragile. The Boston Strangler was the blueprint for modern true crime storytelling, but also a cautionary tale of how easily the truth can be lost beneath the noise. For the people of Boston, the story has faded into history, yet its imprint endures. In quiet neighborhoods where the murders once occurred, plaques and memories linger. The descendants of the victims still search for full closure, hoping that one day every name and every unanswered question will find peace. As for Albert DeSalvo, his grave rests in Peabody, Massachusetts, unremarkable, modest, and almost forgotten. In the decades since, he has remained both a confessed killer and a disputed suspect, a man suspended between guilt and myth. His death in prison remains officially unsolved, another mystery in a story already crowded with them. But perhaps that's fitting. The Boston Strangler case was never meant to be tidy. It was a tragedy of uncertainty, a study in how fear and confusion can blur the edges of truth. In the end, what remains is not a single killer's legacy, but the legacy of a city. One that faced terror, endured hysteria, and emerged wiser, though forever changed. The Boston Strangler's shadow may have darkened the streets of the 1960s, but it also illuminated the dangers of complacency and the fragility of trust. It showed how evil can hide in the ordinary and how easily stories can become legends. And perhaps, most importantly, it taught that behind every headline lies a human story, one that deserves to be remembered not for the horror that ended it, but for the life that once was.